Okay.
So we're live.
Okay. Like, yeah, there we go. I want to make that.
Getting people on board.
Sorry about that. Yeah, people are gonna start climbing on board. There we go. I have a hard time setting it up in the beginning. But we're sorry we're a little late. Tansinina Kanipu Wapaske Mikisimi Kwanapio. Many blessings to all my relations in the four directions. This is yet another yet profound segment, education, part of the educational series of Decolonizing Canada here on Standing Bear Network. And yeah, so we have a lot of things to talk about tonight. I was glad we had time to sort of form out what our conversation was going to look like. The topic tonight is First Nations under siege. Yeah, that's a big one. And I thought I'd just try to give a little bit of a backdrop as to where we stand now. And I thought the vehicle by which I would do that would be Joe Wild, who's the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. So what is this great sense of urgency? I want to open it up, by hearing from Joe Wilder. So let's just give this a minute.
Described in the treaty agreement, and what wasn't delineated and fully described in that agreement would be extinguished.
Oh, sorry. There we go.
Hi, my name is Joe Wild, and I'm the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister at Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. So my role in the department is to oversee a team of just over 350 people who are responsible for doing all of the work in supporting the development of policies to implement and respect Section 35, the Constitution Act of 1982. So in addition to the work related to the development and implementation of policies to further that particular section of the Constitution, our work involves representing Canada at over 150 negotiation tables that are from coast to coast to coast. Those tables represent over 500 Indigenous communities with about 1 million Indigenous people represented. So at those tables, we negotiate instruments such as treaties, self-government agreements, and other constructive arrangements that further the relationship that Canada has with Indigenous peoples. From 1975 until 2015, the treaties are really about addressing certainty. And what certainty meant to Canada was that rather than having a kind of unknown set of Indigenous rights, instead the rights would be delineated and fully described in a treaty agreement. And what wasn't delineated and fully described in that agreement would be extinguished.
Wow. So that's a big load right there, and we're going to discuss it. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. I would like to, introduce to you Russ Diabo, who is Kahnawake Mohawk political analyst, and Rolland Pangowish, also a political analyst. And I'd like you both to introduce yourselves because I know I would do you both a great injustice. I'm honored and humbled, that we're able to do this together and to, help elevate, voices that will help empower our grassroots communities that are really struggling so hard right now. And it's taking them time to get a grasp on some of these things. So how about if we start with you, Russ?
Sure. As you say, I'm a member of the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake, and I've been involved in First Nations politics since I was a teenager. I have experience working with different First Nation governments or Indian bands, band councils, regional organizations. And I also worked at the National Indian Brotherhood, as it was called, in parliamentary liaison. and National Indian Brotherhood was reorganized into the Assembly of First Nations. And the last time I worked there, I was the Indian Act Amendments Coordinator for AFN. So and I've also had other experience, national experience working out of Ottawa, not just at AFN, but living in Ottawa for a number of years.
Right.
So that's where my policy analysis comes from, is from studying the federal government up close.
Thank you, Russ. Roland.
Well, and I know Russ has tracked federal policy for a few decades now, at least 3 or 4. And myself, I'm from Wakwamikong Unceded Indian Reserve, which is on Manitoulin Island in Lake Huron in Ontario. And we're the Council of Three Fires Reserve, because we have Odawas, Ojibways, and Potawatomis. And we're on an island. Also, one of the few unceded reserves in Ontario. We've never been part of a surrender treaty, and that's why we're called unceded. And so our relationship with the Crown in our history goes back to the Niagara Treaty in 1764, which was where the first British Indian Affairs Superintendent, William Johnson, offered peace because we had been fighting the British, Pontiac's uprising and all those events. And so there was 24 nations that made peace with Britain at that time. So we joined the Iroquois and others who had already been friendly to the British. And of course, my old friend Russ, I met in 1977 in school, and we've had lively debates over the years. But coming to this age in time, after various experiences, and I know Russ's experience is a lot more extensive than what he described, and I can only touch the surface on mine as well, I guess, because I did work at Indian Affairs for 3.5 years, unexpectedly. But I was told by because I came to Ottawa wanting to work at AFN, and I had some experience as a summer student, when I was in university doing land claims research. So I was very much into, land rights. And anyways, I ended up at Indian Affairs and learned about I worked in claims funding. So we were financing the research and development of claims through contributions and the negotiation of both specific and comprehensive claims through loan agreements. So I learned the policies on land claims inside out. And finally, that I learned enough that I was able to convince the AFN to hire me. So I started there as a land rights policy analyst, and then a couple of years later, when Ovid was elected, Ovid Mercredi after George, I became the director of land rights, where I lasted, altogether I was at AFN 15 years, over 12 years as the director of a unit that dealt with land claims issues and lands and resources, as well as periodically treaties. AFN over the years would periodically have a treaty unit, and then there would be no funding for it, and it would come back to the land rights office. So we managed to maintain a land rights office while I was there for 15 years. I don't know what they have now, but it seems since I left in 2004, they seem to have changed. At least when I was there, we were still doing advocacy, through the National Political Organization as it was originally established for. But it seems to have changed over the years. I don't see it advocating for the rights or monitoring federal activity, because that used to be the original function. But now we seem to be facing a very big assault on the rights we've fought for, since 1969. Really, I mean, it goes further than that, but 69 is an interesting demarcation point because that was the white paper year, and but my experience has been, because what we stopped the white paper with was the issue of land claims and treaties. And here we are 50 years later, and we see the machinations of the department have, it hasn't been quite as obvious as it is now that they were pursuing those same objectives all along, which was assimilation and an end to the Indian Act, which we all wanted to end the Indian Act, but however, we didn't want to be subsumed under another colonial regime, which is what I think is happening now, and I hopefully will get into that. But and it's especially interesting for me because at the AFN, I also ended up dealing with the human rights issues at the UN. Many years I was sent over there to work with the working group on the draft declaration and then the working group on the permanent forum. And I learned quite a bit about the international human rights standards and the committees. And of course I had learned about those in school, but I didn't realize the practical application. And those are the one international forum where the land rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada have been noted as the biggest human rights problem really in Canada, facing Canada, besides issues of people of color and racism and the disadvantaged people, as well as women's issues. But I think it's only on the Indigenous file that has been consistently at the forefront of the human rights issues at the Human Rights Council, and before the covenant, the two covenants on economic and social rights, and the other one is trying to remember their names, but there's two covenants that come out of the university.
Civil and political rights.
Yeah. And there's monitoring bodies for those, and Canada has to report every 5 years, as does every other state that has signed on to those human rights standards. And those are treaties, those are international treaties. That's why they're monitored. And so Canada has to report there. And I think over the years, we've managed, Indigenous peoples globally have managed to penetrate some of that system and been able to, as non-governmental organizations, have some influence over the discussions that take place and the standards that are being set. And no longer is it are we easily excluded. And it was good to work with people from different countries because I learned about their heritage and how much we share in common. It was amazing because we all pretty much shared the same objectives. So I didn't want to go on too long, but those to me are the, because within working at the national organization for 15 years and dealt with a lot of different issues, coordinated committees, fisheries, forestry, and tried to address these comprehensive claim issues of what they try to call modern treaties, which really are extinguishment. And now we see that all their mechanisms are about extinguishing inherent rights. So, but it's not recognized, and the legal counsel, I don't think, has adequately advised their people from an independent perspective. It seems that the Crown has overridden everything, and yet it really has no right to do that. And hopefully we can talk about that more. So thank you.
Oh man, thank you, Rolland. Thank you so much for that. Let's try to unpack this a little bit. You know, we have a little bit of you know, sort of an organized strategy of approaching this. You know, we understand the sense of urgency right now. You know that you know, many of our people are at these negotiating tables, and you know, let me give you a question. Maybe we'll start with you, Russ, after I ask it. Can each of you give a brief explanation of how the Crown Treaty relationship with First Nations came to be and the legislation to regulate Indians and lands reserved for Indians. I have listed off here some things, just put little notes there. Pre-Confederation Treaties, Royal Proclamation, 1684, Treaty of Niagara, numbered treaties, Indian Act, 1969 White Papers, Constitution Act of 1982, Section 35, alternatives to the Indian Act, and the First Nations Land Management, FNLMA and the FNFMA, First Nations Financial
The
Management.
F and,
Yeah.
Yeah,
All those
yeah.
acronyms.
Anyway, yeah, I'll just quickly say that you've highlighted some of the key points in the relationship between Indian nations and the Crown. You know, the earliest treaties were peace and friendship treaties, you know, with the Micmac and the Maliseet on the Atlantic, and with what was called the Seven Nations Confederacy, which were allied with the French around the island of Montreal, which included Mohawks and Abenakis and Algonquins and Hurons, you know. And Rolland covered a little bit of it, like the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Chief Pontiac burned down, I think, 10 of the 12 forts in the Great Lakes because he didn't trust the British, even though the British made peace and friendship treaties with the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee in 1760. And a lot of people say that's what led to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, because a big part of the Royal Proclamation was it didn't create rights, it recognized pre-existing rights of Indian nations. And a big part of it, they promised that there would be no trespassing in Indian territory, because that was a big complaint amongst a lot of the Indian nations as settlers were encroaching into their territories. And the Royal Proclamation set out that from the Crown's point of view, Indians could only sell their land to the Crown, not to individual settlers or anything. And in a lot of ways, that's what set up the trust or fiduciary relationship, because they were supposed to protect the Indian lands from trespass. That was the promise. And they set up a process, you know, for setting out treaty making. And those promises were repeated in the Treaty of Niagara of 1764 that Rolland was talking about, because my own community, Kahnawake, they were allies of the French, and then they signed a peace and friendship treaty in 1760. So they joined in with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, because the Haudenosaunee Confederacy were allies with the British, and they were threatening the French allies, which included some Mohawks, you know, who were kind of outside of the Haudenosaunee thing. So they all came together under those treaties, and the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, like Rolland said, 24 groups came together in the Treaty of Niagara. And that's probably a significant treaty, because it set into motion the treaties that followed after in Canada, the number of treaties across the prairies and that. So treaty making was a big part of the relationship early on. And that's why in the War of 1812, when the Americans tried to invade Canada, it was the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe warriors who were on the front lines with the British to fight the Americans back, you know. It was after the War of 1812, though, that I'd say about 1840, that in what is now Ontario and Quebec, the southern parts, we became overrun because there was colonists fleeing the United States, you know, the colonies into Canada. And that's when the treaty making in Ontario started, because they wanted to have farms for the military people to settle. And we became outnumbered. So by 1850, they were making laws over us. So in other words, the treaty relationship started to develop into like a legislation relationship in what they call Pre-Confederation, which is before Canada's first constitution. So 1850, they were making laws over us. So in 1867, with the British North America Act, they divided the federal and provincial powers in that first constitution of Canada. And Indians and lands reserved for Indians were federal powers. Section 9124, Section 91 lists all of the federal powers, and Section 92 in that constitution lists all the provincial powers. So Indians and lands reserved for Indians were an exclusive legislative authority for the feds. The idea was to keep those issues away from the local settlers, right? Because the local settlers were coveting Indian lands. So you didn't want to give them the jurisdiction over Indians. So the Imperial Crown had it, you know, when Great Britain was making treaties. And then it came down to the federal government in that first constitution. But then the provinces have powers over natural resources and, you know, hospitals and schools and, you know, minerals. So that's where, you know, there kind of came land use conflicts. And some of the earliest charges against Indians were from the 1960s for hunting and fishing, because they weren't following provincial regulations. They were already Aboriginal treaty rights and winning court cases. But that's what the early court cases started over, was hunting and fishing. Anyways, so the legislative approach took over because in 1876, they passed the Indian Act. And the Indian Act's been the main law. It's in 2022, that's still in place. Despite all of Justin Trudeau's promises, he's maintained the Indian Act. And the reason they maintain the Indian Act, although they've amended it from time to time, it defines who an Indian is. It defines what a band is, what a band council is, the bylaw making powers of a band. So it's the main statute to control Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And since then, they've added other laws. And they use the term First Nations now, which they co-opted from us. They're good at co-opting our language. So there's the First Nations Land Management Act, the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. Now they have the Indigenous Child and Family Services Act, but it's all federal laws, you know. They've added to the Indian Act, but they're also hollowing out the Indian Act. So, you know, the treaty relationship, the original treaty relationship, I would say was it was pushed to the side as they implemented the Indian Act. They ignored the treaties in a lot of ways, and instead created a reserve system under the Indian Act, including a pass system, which was really applied in Saskatchewan and Alberta, you know, from the late 1800s up to the 1940s, where you couldn't leave the reserve without a pass from the Indian agent, because all these reserves had Indian agents to control the Indians, right? So the Indian Act, and that's the main source that the government uses to fund bands and reserves, is the Indian Act. Their authority under the Indian Act for programs and services on reserve comes through the Indian Act. And they pass, you know, bills, you know, it's part of the budgets of the federal government. They used to call them Indian monies when they passed bills through Parliament for Indian programs and services on reserve. But now they call them investments, because there's a shift now away from the treaty and fiduciary relationship. So now they're using the terminology of investments, like they have discretion on whether they're going to fund things or not. Not that they have a legal obligation. So, you know, that's the shift. It went from treaties to legislation, and legislation's been the main thing that they've used ever since. Even these so-called modern treaties, they didn't come about. They're really comprehensive claims settlement agreements, or land claims agreements. And they weren't recognized as treaties until 1983, when the new Constitution from 1982, they had an amendment in 1983, and they said for greater certainty, any land claims agreement that hasn't been settled or may be settled is a treaty, you know, within the meaning of Section 35. And that's how they created a new class of treaties called land claims agreement treaties. But now they've used the term modern treaties, but really it's a comprehensive claims settlement. And that comes from Pierre Trudeau, you know, who came up with a land claims policy in 1973, where he said there are comprehensive claims for Aboriginal title and specific claims for lawful obligations, you know, on unfulfilled treaties or, you know, misappropriation of Indian lands or Indian monies. Those are specific claims. And I always found the term land claims is very prejudicial, pejorative, but they put it into the Constitution. You know, in 1983, it's in the Constitution now that any land claims agreement that has been settled or may be settled is a treaty. And they focused more on modern extinguishment treaties, as Rolland calls them, and I agree, than they have on the original treaties. They're using self-government to implement the original treaties. So there's a difference between treaties. There's what they call the pre-1975 treaties, because the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement of 1975 was the first modern treaty. So there's the pre-1975 treaties, I think the last historic treaty, Rolland, was 1923 with the Williams Treaty, or 1927, somewhere in there.
Uh, yeah,
And
that by
they
dates
did
at
make,
1924, I believe.
okay, so they
23.
stopped historic treaties then, and then they started the modern treaties in 1975 with the James Bay Agreement. So everything the land claims agreements that have been settled since 1975 are called modern treaties. And they even have their own organization separate from AFN, but they're still members of AFN. But they created a separate organization called the Land Claims Agreement Coalition. And that they got together to argue with the government because they said the government wasn't implementing the modern treaties either. So anyways, that's how we move from treaty making into legislation. And so federal laws are used to control and manage, mainly the Indian Act still. But now they've added a whole bunch of other laws to limit and restrict and regulate Section 35 rights.
Great, thank you, Russ. Roland, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess it's important to consider that I think throughout this history that Russ just described, there's been a dichotomy, two different understandings of what's going on. There's what First Nation leaders and communities assumed, and then there's what the government assumed. And it seems to me that conflict was carried on, right up to today, because you look at things like, in the West, they talk about treaty cards, but the department cards have nothing to do with treaties. They're status cards, but yet people call them treaty cards because their link to the crown is through that treaty agreement. So that's how they see the relationship. And, there's the issue of the spirit and intent of treaties. And I think the biggest contrast with the crown on treaty issues has been the crown. And Ron Irwin was almost a demonstration of it.
He was a minister of Indian Affairs.
Yes, sorry. One of the ministers that represents, I think, part of what we're seeing play out today, because he saw the treaties as a checklist, almost like a land transaction, and that they owe this. And, that's why in specific claims they have, you can pursue specific treaty provisions that haven't been fulfilled. And I think that's led a lot of them to consider treaties like a checklist, that they just have to do these things. And once they do them, it's checked off, like treaty land entitlement. But the thing is, the First Nations have never seen it that way, right from the East to the West. All people saw those treaties as their relationship, the basis of making relations with the crown. And I think I've always seen it that way. So like, there's all kinds of confusing issues across the country. It's unique in every region. Like where I come from, the unceded Indian Reserve on Manitoulin, people assume that the department understands what the unceded reserve is, and what our situation is, and it's very hard to convince them that no, the government has never seen it that way. That they don't recognize our unceded rights. And our people have all, under these land claim policies, which are skewed in favor of the crown. Of course, I spent 12 years coordinating two national working groups that attempted to change this specific claims policy into a independent mechanism, because we've always said the crown is in a conflict of interest in dealing with claims against itself. It started out in 1973 under their first policy on specific claims that we'll just work it out. We'll identify where there was a problem and we'll work out a solution. And but it's become much more complex. And And there was, the last time I looked, there was at least 2,000 outstanding specific claims. And I believe there's probably at least that many more, maybe twice as much. And it's not hard to understand when you consider that the government has been unilaterally administering Indian lands and assets for, over 150 years, or what is it now? I'm still in the
140 some, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, many years. So obviously they make mistakes. But these mistakes are of a impactful nature on First Nation communities, the loss of lands, the loss of, trust funds. There's a whole array of damages. And then when the court in 1984, I think it was, the first Garin case,
Yeah.
brought up this concept of fiduciary. I don't recall that term being used before, because we used to talk about the trust relationship, but then all of a sudden it talked about this fiduciary. And I guess what makes a fiduciary distinct from other types of trust relationships is that one party is acting unilaterally on behalf of another. So I don't know, to this day, whether that's the appropriate analogy that the court picked up on, but that original Garin case laid it out pretty clearly that the Crown, especially when dealing with lands, must act honorably and as subject its handling of these matters. The highest standards of conduct are to be applied to these. And I thought that was very good, finally, we're getting somewhere.
Maybe I could just mention what the facts were on that Garin case, Rolland.
Okay,
Quickly.
sure.
It's a good example because not only did the Supreme Court come up with the term fiduciary, but the reason why that case made it to the Supreme Court was it involved the Shaughnessy Golf Course in the outskirts of Vancouver, where the Musqueam lands are. And they had passed a band council resolution, the council saying they agreed to lease that piece of land, but they were looking who they were going to do a long-term lease with themselves. And Indian Affairs took it upon themselves to lease the land out to the golf course, 99-year lease or whatever it was. And they didn't disclose the terms of that lease to the band. And that was in the 1950s. And the band only finally got a copy, as I understand, in the 1970s, where they found that the government settled for a rate lower than what they were asking for in the 1950s. So in other words, they didn't manage professionally the lands to get the highest value that you could get. And that's why they took it to court. And it went up to the court. And I'll just say that Ian Binney was the lawyer for the Department of Justice who wound up becoming a Supreme Court justice after. But he argued throughout the whole case, right up to the Supreme Court, that all Canada owed the Indians was a political trust, not a legal one. And when the court looked at the facts that I just mentioned, that's where they determined that, the government was in charge and they had a fiduciary duty. That's the comparison that they used.
And
because they're going from their experience as a Crown court, right?
Yeah, and they didn't conduct those matters adequately.
Yeah,
not up to the standard required. And then all I've seen though since then, because it was after Oka that we started trying to deal with land claims, and it was impossible to deal with comprehensive claims. So we ended up having to deal with specific claims only, which are clear cut, lawful obligations.
Can I interrupt? Sorry.
Sure.
Because you brought up Oka, I want to make a point about that. Was
okay.
All the Haudenosaunee claims, specific claims for lands, were all pre-Confederation claims because they took Haudenosaunee lands, in the 1800s. Kahnawake, it was even earlier, right? Kahnawake has outstanding land grievances, as they call it. Akwesasne, Tyendinaga, Six Nations have huge lands issues. And the government's position in specific claims up until OCA, until 1990, was they weren't responsible for pre-Confederation claims. But then after 1990 happened, they said, okay, we'll accept pre-Confederation claims. So I just wanted to make that point
Yeah.
for the
And they
Haudenosaunee
always make-
communities.
Well, it just shows though how low they are in terms of conducting themselves on behalf of what is supposed to be honorable, the crown, because they're sleazebags in almost every respect. But anyways, I have to make the case for that. But
Dishonorable, yep.
it's just experience shows you. What did somebody say in the Justice Department after the Garin case? Said, oh, you see this case, this means we have to stop lying, lying, stealing, and cheating.
Yeah.
But they didn't. That's the problem. They just made it more sophisticated. It's like, I don't know, some kind of con game. But you see, these standards, if they're to be applied, it changed the whole world really of specific claims, the perspective, because you're not just talking about omissions, you're talking about breaches of fiduciary obligations. So that made it a more important issue. And it also, well, later then the court in the Sparrow case, oddly enough, involving this members from the same community,
Yes, must have been, yeah.
ended up identifying another type of fiduciary obligation on the crown, which the court said was the crown cannot unjustifiably override inherent rights, existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. But that then, you know, raised the standard again with respect to the crown acquiring lands, because in the view of Canada, it's always been to get a release of inherent rights, Indigenous ownership or land rights over a territory. And what the comprehensive claims.
Just to mention that Sparrow case was the first case in 1990 dealing with Section 35, starting to interpret the rights in Section 35. Just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah. But it expanded it to be dealing with those rights, you know, inherent rights and treaty rights. So it was an expansion of this fiduciary concept. But if this is true, see, this has been my question, because I've been reading everything I can on fiduciary law, especially since I was stopped working. And the number one principle in fiduciary law is the loyalty to the beneficiary. And here we have Canada, who has two legal masters to serve in terms of our people. They have an obligation to us not to infringe upon our rights without justification. And the justification is a whole nother set of issues, but because it set out a test, and I'm sure Russ will talk about that. But in any case, this raising of the standard and showing what is at stake in these matters. And that's why they said the honor of the crown is always at stake in dealing with these matters. Section 9124 matters. And my view of the provinces, yes, they have jurisdiction over lands and resources, but they're obligated to, they must fulfill obligations to Indians in every mechanism, every instrument where the provinces join Canada Confederation. That clause is there, that they have jurisdiction over lands and resources, but it's in different formats. But they must fulfill obligations to Indians. So that's a caveat on their authority. Of course, it's been ignored over the years, but it's coming to the point where now that's why the damages that have been done they're trying to weasel out of it, through self-government. But anyways, because what's going on, I guess I don't want to take up too much time, but there's so much in between all this. Like I said, with in terms of applying a fiduciary view to inherent rights, you've got a whole set of issues, various issues like the test and the onus, and then in specific claims, it's even more, I think, very strong case on our behalf in terms of breaching fiduciary obligations. The punishment, I mean, the compensation there should be no discounting, and discounting's been an issue over the years that they tried to bring into it informally in terms of settling specific claims and what's owed for lost lands. Or
maybe you can explain that a little more, Rolland. What's discounting?
Yeah, well, in specific claims, discounting was, they would see, you'd have to present your claim, the particular issue, what lands were lost, and evidence of that they were taken improperly or lost improperly by Crown action. And so you have to present that case, and then they review it. And it usually, it probably still does take years for their legal review, and they're all paranoid about setting precedent. This is one of the whole problems of dealing with them, because they don't want to set any precedent that is going to bind them in future to anything that they did not write. So what they do is they keep it for years, and then finally they'll come back, okay, there's an issue here, and they try to twist it and change it. They'll say, okay, we'll accept this for negotiation, but it's only on this basis. So they don't accept it at face value for what a First Nation puts forward. And during our claims, the attempts to change the process, that was one of the issues. Was these claims are being manipulated. They're not they should be dealt with on the basis of the First Nation, what they feel the damages are or what's been done to them, not based on a federal definition. And then you have to go through all kinds of changes to make it fit into their policy framework. And I guess the other thing is there's a lot of smoke and mirrors or misnomers, like under specific claims, under some of these self-government arrangements, there's a thing they call negotiations where you discuss your options. Well, those are not true negotiations, because they're within policy frameworks that are imposed on the discussion. It's a predetermined outcome. Basically, all you're doing when you go into these so-called negotiations is they'll give you a checklist and pick which one you want. There's nothing outside of that. So that's not nation to nation. That is not respectful of a relationship First Nations feel they have. And it makes me sick when I see Trudeau talking as if he believes in our rights, and they're going to recognize them. And meanwhile, they're just doing this screwing us in the back. But and they're continuing to do it. I call it the wolf in sheep's clothing, because as Russ mentioned, they steal our vocabulary. Now we're calling it First Nations, then Indigenous peoples. We can't come up with our own designations that they don't steal and manipulate into meaninglessness. So, because today, sometimes I remember old Saul Sanderson when he was going at it. He always insisted on Indian.
A Cree leader and elder now.
Yeah, he would even change the wording in agreements. He wanted it Indians because the treaty said Indians and the laws said Indians. And sometimes I think there was some good logic to that, because now what they do is they change the definitions through policy, and you think and this again is that dichotomy. We have people sitting at a table, and one side thinks they're talking about one thing, and the other side is talking about something else. You think you're talking about, ensuring your people's survival and livelihood, and they're talking about terminating your potential livelihood. So what's been taken from you. So it's a really, I don't want to sound too general, because there's so much to it. And anyways, I'm taking up too much time on this, but that's the thing with the policies today, though. You see, under these alternatives to the Indian Act, yes, we want to get out of the Indian Act, but we haven't had those. I don't know how many community people feel like there's been the discussion. Where was the discussion? Where is these things they promised? Like the legal review in view of legal requirements and also by the standard of the World Declaration standard. So they're not there, and what they're doing is they're removing that fiduciary obligation. When you take up the Land Management Act is the best example, I suppose, elections, whatever it is, there's this aspect where you release the Crown from its lawful obligations in future. Allegedly, you can still claim for, breaches when the law was before under the Act. See, under the Act, even though it's legislation,
Which act?
Right?
Which act are you talking about?
Of the Indian Act. I mean,
Okay.
it has requirements, and things may not be the way you see, like the tax exemption. Our people see it as we're nations, and we're not subject to their tax regime. But the way they see it is it's an exemption for a specific purpose. It's a legislated exemption. It's not based on our inherent rights. So anyway, there's a lot of arguments like that. And I think maybe the best thing, the way I can help, and perhaps all of us, is if people ask questions about these things, and then we can address the particulars of how they seek this release. And it's all, you can call it termination, you can call it extinguishment, you can call it surrender. That is what they're doing. They set up the corporations, these so-called national institutions, and I guess they're all located in BC for some reason. And what they are is corporations that are set up through legislation that they take up the slack when you go into an alternative to the Indian Act, like the Land Management Act. You'll no longer be dealing with the feds, and it says right in there, the money sent to you will no longer be Indian monies. So you're going to be subject to taxation. In fact, they want you to tax because it's all designed that way. The last thing I'll say about, I mean, there's so much more to say, but and what's happening is, okay, yes, we have a right to self-governance. They're saying they recognize that, but the way they're going about it is not very good. Because under the Indian Act, they never funded us adequately under the Indian Act to fulfill the requirements of the Indian Act. For instance, in land management, it's always been adequate funding for land management on the reserve. And so
Not to mention education and health and housing. And so
and they're
on.
using that squeeze now through the department to steer you towards their self-government arrangements, which take you right out of that fiduciary area and puts you as, in conclusion, I guess, you become like a federal municipality, which is a corporate body. You know, municipalities are corporate mechanisms of the province. And that's fundamentally what First Nations become under that. So you don't see a lot of diversity in the design of governing institutions created under these alternatives. They're basically adopting the white man's way of managing land, which is to survey it out into lots and value it in dollar monetary terms. And then you're able to tax it. That's what they want us to do. And a lot of people don't know what's going to happen because the way my grandparents saw it was that we have the reserve will always be safe there. But it's no longer the case the way they're making it, because once you're a municipality and there's no more fiduciary obligations on the part of the Crown, see, they're gonna ease that transition as long as they have to with funding, but they won't be obligated to provide that funding. It'll only, I imagine there'll be all these human rights issues coming up in the future of people starving out in the bush. But anyways, what's going to happen is that they want everybody then will be under those institutions, those corporate bodies. You'll be a corporate body in relationship to that corporate institution. There's no more records at Indian Affairs. They don't need them. It's going to be with those institutions. And basically, I don't see how that has anything to do with inherent rights. I don't see it how it has anything to do with self-determination, because you are steered into, basically what it does though, when you become that corporate body, you have to raise your own funds. So number one, taxation, but that's not ever going to be enough, especially from our own people. So, but it's very restrictive how you can tax anybody else. And then you will have to invest. You will have to become, because that's what municipalities do, invest in stocks and all this stuff. But so you're
Finish
more
your
and more,
bonds.
yeah, tied into the market economy, which we sort of have a shield under the crown. But when you remove that shield, then you're just subject to the whims of that market, how good your people are at investing.
That's
And
right.
some of them think they're going to be real good. And, you know, the old story, but that's the thing. Then you're subject to an economy over which you have no control, or less control, you know, less control over over your future. Your future then goes along with that marketplace. And that's my concern. But anyways, I went on too long about this, and it's so I'm talking in such general terms, I feel foolish. But the thing is, once you understand that, then you can look at these mechanisms and these legislations and policies. And that lady put out a paper, I forget what it's called. She traced the legislation going back to 2000. Because
Whether the Indian Act.
yeah, and that's why I got fired at AFN, because I was associated with Russ and he was opposing these national institutions. And but anyways, I got caught in a division nationally there. And
But I was right.
yeah, but when you see her paper, Hither the Indian Act, Hither the
Yeah.
Indian Act.
Whether the
And she
Indian Act.
traces it right there. You can see
Sue
all the
Collis,
bills.
her name is Sue Collis.
Yeah, an excellent paper. I mean, it's kind of difficult language for maybe many of our people, but it's excellent because it does trace the legislative, what's been going on. And it's like, it doesn't matter if it's conservative or liberal government. And then you have Mr. Trudeau in the smiling face, bringing something in that's deadly. It's deadly in a way. Sometimes I think, man, they finally did it. They've been working at this for years. As you can see, the setup started in 2004 or whenever the bills were passed, setting up those. There was one national institution that First Nations actually got control of, the Statistics and Data Institute. But as soon as they realized First Nations were controlling that, they terminated it.
Yeah, they cut the funding off.
Yeah, but this is a typical recurring, you see, the problem is these things happen in waves. And I think Russ and I have lived long enough to see the roller coaster and to see how things come back around. They do it again. And
But Rolland, just on the national institutions, it was in 1999 that the First Nations Land Management Act passed, when Jean Chrétien was prime minister and Ron Irwin was minister.
mhm,
And it was in 2004 when Robert Note was Minister of Indian Affairs and Jean Chrétien was prime minister,
yeah.
that they passed the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. So I
And
just
they brought
wanted
in
to point that out because a lot of those ideas and the legislation came out of the white paper. And Chrétien has been, I would say, responsible for all of this since 1969, because he started out as the Minister of Indian Affairs until I think 1972 or 74, somewhere in there. Then when the Constitution was being negotiated, he was the Justice Minister, and he negotiated the wording on Section 35 that we're still living with. And then he became Prime Minister in 1993, until 2004, and that's where he got that legislation through. Although we did kill the Indian Act Optional Modification Act, and we did kill the First Nations Governance Act that he tried to push. So we had a couple of wins there, but my point is that Chrétien has had him and Pierre Trudeau have had a lot of legacy is still what we're dealing with now, especially through Pierre Trudeau's son. He's carrying on a lot of what his father started.
Yeah.
So just wanted to make those points.
Yeah, I like to explain to people that liberal, they don't realize what liberal really means in the classical sense, the classical Western political sense. Liberal is free to hold your property free of seizure.
Yeah.
That's liberty. It's about property. It's not about individual freedom that people usually think of it, I guess. But it is about capitalism and a materialistic society. And I think that's part of it, because our people don't come from a materialistic society in that manner.
We didn't.
But when you're in poverty so long, you become very materialistic, which I think is part of the problem. You see, what's created the problem has also created the barrier to solving the problem in terms of recognizing inherent rights and meeting an international standard in terms of self-determination. It's basically Canada's deciding what self-determination will be. I'm sorry, Russ, I went too broadly.
No, you made good points. Good points.
Yeah. But yeah, this recent Bill C-115 is like a domestication of the
C-15?
Yeah, the UN declaration.
Yeah, that's Bill C-15.
Yeah, what they're basically doing, there's another good paper on that some students did. I like their paper. They talk about, what did they call it? It's like a preemptive strike. They're out ahead of it. They already recognize our rights. So there's no need to measure it internationally. I mean, they can determine what's self-determining because they recognize it.
That's exactly what Jean Chrétien did when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report came out, remember? He said, oh, we don't need to listen to these recommendations. We're doing it already. We already recognize self-government. So we're doing it. And then they just put the Royal Commission report on the shelf.
Yeah. What people don't realize is exercising delegated authority is different than exercising an inherent right. And we shouldn't be afraid of the issue of sovereignty. In Canada here, we have a real paranoia because of Quebec about discussing sovereign authorities. Whereas in the United States, tribal governments are readily acknowledged to have sovereign authority, but it's subject to management by Congress. But that's what enables them to have casinos. Here we have the Indian Act imposed, and Section 89 or whatever it is that says laws of general application will be applied.
Section 88.
Section 88, yeah. These laws of general application are the provincial laws and regulations. And they're in their so-called self-government agreements, they're ensuring that goes along with it. So they're not getting rid of the Indian Act. That's one of we used to say, all you have to do is get rid of that and we'll be okay. So because that commercial, I just want to see what's going to happen in terms of commercial operations and everything. They don't want us to have any advantages such as like tribal governments, having casinos. But of course, the federal government down there in the states requires the tribes to negotiate with the state, to make arrangements for sharing revenue. But at least they're free of the state law, except as specifically directed. Here, they've made it the default position that provincial laws apply over us, and unless it's specified in a federal law, then the provincial law applies, and that's why we lost gaming in the Kahnawake case. But it shouldn't be final. But the way things are going, we're going to have difficulty, I think, in the future with any of this, and I'm afraid the younger generation is going to find out, hey, what the hell? What the hell happened here? It's like the Yukon Comprehensive Claim Umbrella Agreement. It was signed in 1990, and they accepted a $50 million payment back then for releasing the tax exemption. So later on, I guess, 15 years later, or even longer, 18 years, I remember a young chief coming up to me and going, "Hey, why are they making us pay tax?" And I had to explain to him the application of that agreement, that they signed it away. And so when you look at those kind of requirements, those show that our inherent rights are not recognized. Just saying they recognize the inherent right is not adequate, because every self-government authority that they would recognize has to be approved by them. And under federal law, for instance, this recent Child and Family Services Act reminds me of, because they say, okay, you have to try to work out an agreement with the province. I think it's 1 year.
Yeah, 1 year.
Yeah, and if you can't work something out with the province, then you can proceed under federal authority. Why didn't they say First Nation authority? No, they said federal. So all of it is delegated federal authority. It's not inherent authority.
But Rolland, that's all consistent with the 1995 inherent right policy, which again, Jean Chrétien's government brought in, Mr. White Paper.
Yeah.
He imposed that policy when Ron Erwin was Minister of Indian Affairs. That policy has not been changed, and it sets out preconditions. It's an anything but inherent right policy because it has preconditions. And that's the policy that converts Indian bands into municipalities, because it says your laws have to be harmonized. It has to be within the constitutional framework of Canada, meaning that federal and provincial division of powers from 1867. And so that really only leaves local government, right? You're exercising that delegated authority you're talking about. And actually the Union of Ontario Indians, they had the Anishinaabe Education Act that passed through the federal parliament. And there's a clause in there that says that it has to be operated, the education system set up amongst the Anishinaabe communities in Ontario have to be consistent with the laws of Ontario. So they've accepted that in that agreement. And they're now negotiating a self-government agreement, as are other groups across the country, under that policy. But Justin Trudeau didn't change that policy. He's using that policy. Even though in 2018, in his Valentine's Day speech in the House of Commons, remember he was hugged by Jody Wilson-Raybould, and he talked about his rights recognition framework. He said, we're going to replace the comprehensive claims and self-government policies with something better, he said. But they haven't replaced that self-government policy. They're still using it. And they didn't get that law passed, and then in that law, they wanted to say that all Indigenous peoples have the rights, powers, and privileges of a natural person at law, which is a corporation. They didn't get that passed. So what they're doing now is they're doing it at the different negotiation tables instead of trying to get national legislation through. Because that was in the 1997 Optional Indian Act Modification Act, Bill C-79. They wanted to have band councils have the powers, rights, and privileges of a natural person at law. That got killed. The First Nations Governance Act had that same thing in there. That got killed. And First Nations rejected the 2018 Rights Recognition Framework Bill that Justin Trudeau was proposing. So that's when Carolyn Bennett announced after, we're going to negotiate it with our partners at the different tables. So that's what they're doing, is they're peddling that in the self-government agreements they're trying to get bands to sign on to. And the problem is they're doing it in secret, and they're doing it band by band. So community members don't even know what's being negotiated at the table on their behalf,
Yeah, real lack of transparency.
And you have to sign non-disclosure agreements in those negotiations, so you can't even talk to other bands about what's going on at their table. But the federal negotiators can talk to each other and say, how's it going in BC or Ontario or Quebec? How are your tables going? What are the issues? So they get to strategize on how to come back at us band by band at the different tables, table by table. But it's all the inherent right policy, as they call it, of Jean Chrétien's, and I, as you know, I was involved with the Liberal Party from 1990 to 94. And in the Red Book, we got them to promise that a Liberal government would act on the premise that the inherent right was already exists in Section 35. But then when they formed a majority government in 95, they opposed that policy. and they added money to the negotiations. And so now you got hundreds of bands at the negotiating tables because there's money attached, process dollars, right? As you know, they don't mind funding process. It's commitments they have problems funding. But the preconditions in that policy, that's what you're having to accept once you start accepting funding to those agreements. It comes to becoming that municipal corporation you're talking about. And the Métis nations of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario in 2019, they agreed to that in a recognition and self-government agreement, a template agreement. Those three regions of Métis agreed to be persons, you know, a natural person at law. So they've agreed to become municipal corporations. But now they're trying to get First Nations to accept what the Métis accepted, you know, at different tables. They're not trying to do it through national legislation because they failed 3 times to achieve that. So now they're doing it band by band in secret. I just thought I'd point that out because you were talking about the self-government policy.
Yeah, no, it's, to me, it's an insidious policy framework, but it doesn't help to understand that in terms of, in the practical sense of communities trying to survive and retain enough revenue to operate, you know, to provide services and so forth. It becomes difficult because you have to accept these various policy frameworks, but I think it's really violates the sense of what fiduciary law is supposed to mean when what they're doing is really not explained. The end product is not explained. They focus on all these things that might sound good to community people, but they're not.
But that's what they did in 2015. The Liberals in 2015, they promised a reconciliation process, a reconciliation relationship, nation-to-nation process. They were going to recognize the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all 94 calls to action. They were going to adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They were going to do a law and policy review. You know, they made all these big promises. But since then, over the last 6 years, what have they done? They've basically taken over the 3 national Indigenous organizations in what they call, they said that they were, in 2015, Trudeau announced he was going to take a 2-track approach. 1 track was going to be short-term issues, 1 track was going to be longer-term issues. But really, the way I've seen it is the short-term track was really dealing with Section 9124 issues, so on-reserve programs and services issues. And the other track is Section 35 issues, the longer-term negotiation of Aboriginal and treaty rights. And, you know, what they did was they came up with a Canadian definition of the UN Declaration. That's what the Bill C-15 is, you know, the UN Declaration Act. But the bigger thing I think that nobody even talks about this is that they dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs in 2019 in an 800-page omnibus budget bill. They buried in there a law that dissolves the Department of Indian Affairs and creates 2 new federal departments. The Department of Crown, the Department of Indigenous Services Canada, and the Crown Indigenous Relations Northern Affairs Department. And you know, when I ran for national chief, I kept saying to the chiefs, you have to ask yourself, why are there 2 departments? I was trying to get them to see that the 2 departments were set up to process bands into becoming Indigenous governments, you know, municipal governments. So to move out of Indigenous Services Canada into Crown Indigenous Relations, they would implement the agreements. That's their job. There's a division of powers. Indigenous Services Canada is only a transitional department until they can offload or transfer all programs and services onto these Indigenous governing bodies. Because that's the thing, they don't talk about Indian bands directly anymore. They talk about Indigenous governing bodies. And both departments use the same definition of what an Indigenous governing body is. It's a transitional term. It says an Indigenous governing body is a council, meaning a band council, a government, meaning an Indigenous government that signed a self-government agreement, or an entity with Section 35 rights, like one of those child and family services entities you're talking about. Those are Indigenous governing bodies. And Indigenous Services Canada, for example, has a mandate to deliver services to Indigenous individuals or to work out agreements with Indigenous governing bodies. They're not talking about band councils anymore. That's why they had to dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, was they couldn't deliver services to Métis because they were the Department of Indian Affairs Act was tied to the Indian Act. But once they got rid of the administrative structure, then they could take a pan-Indigenous approach to delivering programs and services to Indigenous individuals and then these Indigenous governing bodies. So now you see Métis child and family services agencies, First Nations ones, and Inuit ones. And when they, I say they took over AFN, they took over all three organizations in 2017 when they got AFN to sign a memorandum of understanding on joint priorities, because they basically made AFN what they call a bilateral mechanism, which basically means two sides. They set up like a joint committee that's plugged into the federal cabinet decision-making process. And they say that's to co-develop policy and law. That was all while Perry Bellegarde was national chief. But all I see them doing was they just use AFN to say they're co-developing that. But the feds control the process, the agenda, and the pen. I mean, the process, the process, the agenda, the pen, and the funding. And with the funding, they set the agenda, right? And they decide the process. And it was Michael Warnick, who was clerk of the Privy Council, I'd say, that basically took over those organizations through that MOU. Because that's when they started to get this legislation passed, like the Indigenous Child and Family Services, Indigenous Languages Act, and even the Bill C-15, which we call CANDRIP, the Canadian Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That all got passed when Perry Bellegarde was national chief. So all that heavy lifting stuff was all done, from basically 2015 until 2021. So now a lot of our people don't even know, because when you and I worked at AFN, we used to have to do technical briefings to the chiefs to explain this is what the government policies and legislative changes mean, the implications for inherent and treaty rights. AFN stopped doing critical analysis of policy from what I can see under Perry Bellegarde, and they just went along with the federal government. And as you know, a lot of community chiefs relied on AFN to do the critical analysis, the policy analysis, because they couldn't afford to hire lawyers and policy analysts and that for all this, national legislation and national policies. So once they got AFN not doing critical analysis and the provincial organizations not doing it, people just fell in line and went along with the changes. That's what I see happened over the last 6 years. And that's why we're at the situation we are now, where they've got, what did they say, 400 and some First Nations are at tables. I think there's about 160 bands left that aren't at a recognition table. But the vast majority are at a recognition table, including the Prairie Treaties. They have like Treaty 6, Treaty 8 in Alberta. They got all these groups lined up in Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Right across the country, they have these tables. And they're supposed to lead to, joint negotiation mandates, but they're all under that self-government policy. So band by band, they're going to use the money, because that's the other thing they agreed to, was a new fiscal policy. So now they're offering the 10-year grants, right? And those are managed by the First Nations Financial Management Board, one of the national institutions you were referring to. Remember they said they were optional at the time, but now they're central to the new fiscal relationship, those national institutions, including the
They've
First
become
Nations
key.
Tax Commission.
They're
What's
key
that?
to the policy of unloading
Yeah.
fiduciary obligations.
Yeah.
That's the key.
And so now there's two fiscal policies. There's the 10-year grant for the Indian Act bands, but now also there's a self-government fiscal policy, which is online. You can look it up. And in there, it says it's based on own source revenue, like you said, where you got to raise your own money. They're still going to give some transfer payments. They're going to reduce them, and they're saying you have taxation powers, use them. You have to make up the difference. We're reducing the transfer to you. So that's what that new policy does. It sets out a formula, a self-government formula for funding. but it's no longer based on treaty or fiduciary obligations. It's a new relationship,
Mhm.
as a municipal corporation.
And they're going to say that each individual agreement is unique, or it's, to that group. But it's really, to me, it's looking like what the Treaty 6 chiefs in Alberta feared in 1982. They were the only group to oppose the Section 35 adoption in Canada's Constitution, because they feared the mixing of Métis, non-status, Inuit rights with
Yeah,
Treaty First Nations.
Urban Aboriginal.
Yeah, that it would be used to water down the nation-to-nation relationship and the rights of Treaty First Nations. And that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Yeah,
it's amazing, because they went to court in England,
Yeah,
and to say that their treaties were with the British Crown.
they tried to block the passage of the Canada Bill with the new Constitution back in 1981.
But there was a ruling in, I forget the name of it, the
Sir
House of Lords guy,
Lord Denning.
Lord Denny. Yeah,
Denning, yeah.
he made the ruling that no, the Crown in right of Canada has inherited all the obligations of the British Crown. That's why they couldn't get away with the Pre-Confederation treaties. They're obligated just as the British Crown had made them. So they're obligated. What they're doing, what their policies do, is release them from obligations basically as much as possible.
Yeah, they want to limit the Crown liabilities. But
yeah,
let's remember, Roland, you made reference to it, is that the permanent government in Canada is the bureaucracy. Conservative and liberal governments come and go. Mostly it's been liberals, but conservatives get in there, and then they're probably going to get in there the next time, sometime,
the Cowboys.
However long the Liberal NDP alliance lasts, it's probably going to be the Conservatives next. But my point is that our people need to understand it's the bureaucracy that's the real government, because it's a bureaucracy that takes these election platforms and turns them into fitting with the federal objectives. The promises that Trudeau made in 2015, Michael Warnick had to take those and turn those into a national reconciliation plan based on federal objectives, which, is to, end our rights, finish off what the Indian Act started, basically. And there's a committee of deputy ministers that meets every week. And underneath them is a federal steering committee of assistant deputy ministers. And their job is to track all the tables across the country to make sure that there's no precedent of the national standards and the national policy framework you referred to. They don't want any precedents coming out of any of those tables. So that's the assistant deputy minister, the federal steering committee's job of bureaucrats, is to keep track of all those tables to make sure. And Joe Wild, the guy who John started out with, he's the main guy. I call him the main federal terminator. His job is to be in charge of all those negotiation tables across the country, right up into the right into the center of government, the Privy Council, Cabinet, the Prime Minister. Because there's also a Cabinet Committee on Reconciliation, and that AFN agreement plugs AFN right into that Cabinet Committee and their decision making. So that's the problem, is Trudeau's taken a top-down approach since 2015, a secretive approach, basically using band councils and chiefs organizations, bypassing the people, and certainly bypassing the hereditary and the traditional chiefs, like the Wet'suwet'en or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or the Three Fires or the Midday, whatever traditional governments we talk about, they're bypassed too. Even though the UN declaration, they say that they're implementing, Article 18 says that Indigenous peoples have a right to decision-making through their own institutions and their own procedures, which the Indian Act bans and band councils are not our own institutions or procedures. Those are colonial ones. But that's what Justin Trudeau and his government have been using, because they control them through the funding. And they have spent about $29 billion from 2015 to 2021, I guess, of new money on top of about the 10 billion a year that they spend, or 12 billion a year. That's on top of that. And now they're talking about this Liberal NDP supply and confidence agreement is going to help maintain stability for Indigenous funding, because there'll be 4 budgets, more housing, more programs and services. But yes, there'll be tens of billions of new money from that Liberal NDP alliance, but it's still going to be under this Colonial Indian Act system and the termination system that they're forcing us into. And the NDP are going along with that. They haven't done any analysis or critique of what the Liberals have been doing. They're accepting it. Guys like Charlie Angus and all of them that proclaim to be our advocates, they're going along with the Trudeau government on implementing the self-government policy and their manipulation of the specific claims. Because, now I see that the specific claims process that was supposed to be independent, the government's taking control of that process again. It's not independent. And as you know, in this latest version, they said no claims worth more than 150 million can go to the tribunal that they set up to supposedly be an independent tribunal, which they wound up appealing their decisions to the court anyway. So there's so much for the independence.
Yeah.
So the Trudeau government's done all this stuff and the leaders aren't talking about it. They're not talking about how Trudeau's saying one thing and doing another, because he's flowing all that additional billions of dollars to the band offices. So nobody's saying anything. Plus that the process dollars at the negotiating tables or discussion tables. So, our people don't even know half this stuff is happening because it doesn't leave the band office, right?
I don't know what happened to accountability. I mean, it used to be used against the chiefs. Oh, there must be accountability to your people and all this. And now that's forgotten. It's like they use whatever's trendy at the time to.
I also think it's
accomplish their
because our
goals.
people are going through hard times, with the opioid epidemic and all the other the poverty, the problems our people are having. Like, I just don't think many of them have the ability to organize to even raise these issues.
Yeah.
They're just trying to survive. And the
Well,
government's taking advantage of that, right?
Yeah. Well, I went home to the reserve for 15 years and I don't know what I'm going to do now because it's so bad there. And the people, I mean, they want help, so I want to help. But the thing is, the chief and council system, they're just transferring it over to, they tried to do this Land Management Act. I don't know what they'll do next. They're trying elections. And our people already rejected an elections code, a custom election code a number of years ago. And the thing is, as you see, the agreements that are negotiated with Métis and others with less claim, because I've never seen Métis rights could be anything but derivatives from First Nations. But in any case, without getting into that argument, the thing is, did we ever think we'd see the day when we're all at the same standard in terms of relations with the Crown? I mean, I'm not trying to pull down, what they're trying to achieve, but at the same time, we have, nations that made agreements and nations that are recognizing Canada's constitutional framework because it includes that proclamation. And for us, the Niagara Treaty really promised a standard of relationship. And at one time, it was very important. For like 70 years, they were using us as allies, and we were always fighting to protect our land. That was always our objective, and we got screwed every time. The French left us empty-handed, and then the British against the Americans. Like for our people, we were involved in battles and so forth, and fought voluntarily, and we won all the battles we were involved with. The Americans complained at one point about what we did to them, but the thing was, it was George Washington that started the not only destroying crops and villages, but they would destroy the grave sites of our people. And one of our chiefs told the British, when the Americans complained about the mutilation of the American soldiers at Niagara, this was at Niagara Falls, our chiefs explained to them that this is what the Americans have been doing to us. And that's why we had to do that, because they've been desecrating, our ancestors. And that was really a Washington tactic, George. But anyways, I think the important thing, though, these so-called standards of conduct, Crown conduct, and I know we need to develop more practical means of surviving under this assault, but it's very difficult when we can't talk about it. First of all, you have to establish the grounds that, hey, there is something going on here. And we're not even at that point amongst First Nations across the country. There are some First Nations that recognize what's going on, but the vast majority don't seem to, and are, I think they've been overtaken by assimilation and materialism. The property-oriented reality, as opposed to the traditional view. And, I'm not anti-capitalist. I'm not anti-capitalist, but at the same time, I'm not a fan of, corporate control. And I think self-determination requires the people to enter things consciously. But I found at home, we had a real problem building consensus. For one thing, people aren't interested in this stuff anymore like we used to be, it seems to me. And there are people, some that are, but they're a minority. And then on top of that, it's difficult to get information as to what it is going on. They seem to have eliminated consultation. All they have to do is consult with these PTOs or AFN, and they can go ahead and do whatever they want, because as long as they keep, and it's all
The money
temporary
flowing.
funding. This is why I say inherent rights is where our livelihood rests. What they're throwing at us now is peanuts. When we're entitled to a livelihood, we have people accepting peanuts, because I used to call them the quick buck chiefs, because they dream of making revenue quickly. And that's where they get sucked into these federal schemes, because they think it's the opportunity. And for most, it is not an opportunity. I think when the model was introduced, the chiefs were squarely against the Land Management Act. I remember Robert Louis, there was, original 13 communities that pursued it, and they were mostly adjacent to urban centers where they could take advantage of the economic opportunities, and especially West Bank, they're leasing some 2,500 lots or something like that, and so long-term leases, but they get revenue out of it. So that was advantageous for them, but the model wasn't supposed to be the model, And here, when Trudeau came in, they allocated $150 million to push the Land Management Act as a model on people. And it's not even appropriate for people, in northern areas that have very little opportunity to take advantage of. Where's their tax base going to come out of? It's just inconceivable how this has been pushed, how it went from that optional, because I remember Chief Louis, this is 1988, I believe it was. No, not 88, sorry, 97, when we had the annual assembly in Sutina outside of Calgary. There was a big argument with Robert Louis, and then the Elders Council, which doesn't intervene very often, did at that time. And Robert Louis argued with them, which was really sort of insulting. And they were opposed to it, vast majority. Only those, the only reason they agreed, okay, you can do what you want, but don't affect us. That's always been same with comprehensive claims. When the Nisga'a reached an agreement in 1990, I think it was, this is at the time that we were having a lot of controversy too, but again, that is not the model. After that, they established the BC Treaty Commission, and I remember them saying, oh no, we're going to have a made in BC process. And we tried to explain to them, but no, the policy framework is going to be applied. It took them years to finally realize that, and that's why you had no agreements coming out of it, because these policies are geared towards extinguishment of rights. So basically, they had to get rid of the surrender clause, because I used to point out the comprehensive land claim agreements. I had one on my wall in my office, and I had one of the treaties, one of the numbered treaties on my wall, and they both had the same clause. You hereby cede, release, and surrender your heirs, hereby cede, release, and surrender forever all the lands detailed below.
Right.
And with the Robinson treaties, the first ones on that model said, except those lands you will retain for yourselves. But then by the time they got into the numbered treaties, they changed the wording a little bit to say to the crown, and the crown will set aside for you lands. But that none of that was the understanding of the treaty signatories at the time. And that was very important. We got that legal principle established in Canada, which is sort of an achievement, but we've let it slip away because you still have to have evidence, to strengthen your case before a judge. And the one thing I know we're trying to cover some intensive issues, but the one thing I think needs to be mentioned, what was it? Shoot, I forgot what it was, Russ. But I mean, the standards that are being applied are not consistent with those international standards. And they think by getting this act through, I don't understand why the legal counsel, nobody would advise that this is going to have serious implications, for inherent rights. It's a very difficult thing to understand. But you see, and then when we get into the practical world, it is a difficult thing for chiefs and councils to deal with. So I think we need to be able to find solutions to this but it's being pushed on people so quickly that I think it's going to be fait accompli before people realize what's happened. But I do think there will be an opportunity, because
I don't see it as a fait accompli en masse, but
Mhm.
certainly some bands will go into it and others will see what's happening and not. Because there's 630 bands across Canada,
Yeah,
and about 460 or 450 of them are at tables. So there's about 165 that aren't at a table yet. So I think those ones are going to be watching what's happening to the ones who are negotiating.
I think the key is still to assert rights, not wait for the government's definition, but assert what you understand your rights to be. Although that's a very difficult road. It's the only road, because they will make you look like a criminal, which they've done to various communities when they stand up. And
sovereignty,
yeah,
like the tribal sovereignty on the US side, we don't have that exerted up here in Canada.
no, and the model they're implementing now is going to ensure we never have that recognition. And that's the whole point.
Yeah.
I think, because they can't fit it into the crown. Oh yeah, this is what it is. This assertion of crown sovereignty, which is what the Royal Proclamation is. It's the British Crown saying, we have jurisdiction over all this territory. And then they mention us, and then they agree that they have to deal with us. But there's no legal basis for that. That's colonialism. It was during a colonial era. South America went through it with the Portuguese and the Spanish.
That's the doctrine of discovery.
Yes, which has no legal basis. And of course, in common law, that the Mabel case in Australia really stripped away any legal basis for that being a valid basis for the assertion of this crown jurisdiction. So, but it's not a question that anybody's raising in Canada. although the question is there, because if there's no basis for that original assertion of Crown sovereignty, to me, it raises a whole number of questions, and also makes what they're implementing now even more insidious. Because if you're having your rights judged by their courts that aren't even legal, you can't challenge that in their courts. The court would
No.
would be undermining its own jurisdiction. So to me, it's an issue that I wish could be.
That's why the international law and principles, I think, are important, because we're not going to get settler courts to question the doctrine of discovery, because that's their reason for being. That's how they got established. But
So
I just want to say, we've been going at it for a while. I don't know if anybody's even watching, John, or if you have any questions coming in, but maybe we could try and deal with some questions for people too.
Absolutely.
Rolland had suggested that earlier.
Yeah. So at this stage, we're about an hour and 45 minutes in. I want to thank everybody, who's joined us. We've had about 30 people consistently watching. And this is Standing Bear Network, and this segment is First Nations Under Siege. I want to thank Russ Diabo and Rolland Pangowish for being with us. And what I want to just communicate now is just go, if you have questions, we are monitoring Facebook right now, and we'll be happy to get to those.
We have a 5-minute break.
I guess you want to take a 5-minute break?
If it's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
All right, we're gonna. I'll chat with Russ a little bit, and so yeah, First Nations Under Siege. You can go ahead and take a break. Yeah.
He's done most of the talking anyway.
I know, bless his heart.
He's got a lot to say.
Yeah, he's really informative. And for those of you out there who want to know who the quiet guy was, that's Rolland Pangowish. He is brilliant, articulate, and a wealth of knowledge. And what Standing Bear Network's intention here is, we are trying to, and Russ and Rolland have been doing it for a long time. We are trying to, educate, everybody from grassroots to postgraduate. This is stuff that should be in educational institutions. I think it's going to help our grassroots communities to acquire. It'll help them with the tools that they need to decide what their self-determination plan is going to look like on the ground. And so, for those of you who haven't already, we have a playlist called Decolonizing Canada. Go check it out. I think we have about 5 films there now, with Russ, Rolland, Thomas Monius, from Pemichikamak territory, and Isidore Papanicus talks about Pemichikamak sovereignty there as well. These are really important issues. We are. It's almost like I see it as the end game of colonialism. And I don't know how serious I'm going off the agenda of talking about this, since Rolland's gone, but I think a lot of people feel detached in the sense that whatever it is you're going to call me, whether it's Bill C-15 or Isidore is like talking about having labels and Post-its put all over his face, and I think there's is there a sense that no matter what the government does, people are just going to do whatever it is they want and walk away from any type of crown, federal, provincial jurisdiction?
As soon as you set foot off reserve and try and do that, if you're pushing land rights or something, you're likely to be charged, and you have to defend yourself in court, either criminal court or civil court. So, if you don't, if you're not prepared, the courts have put the burden of proof on us. Regardless of what we feel our own identity is, that dichotomy that Rolland talked about, we're still having to face the provinces, right? All of our communities are surrounded by provinces. And once you start going out there, cutting trees down or trying to do anything under your own authority, you're going to be charged and being taken into court or facing injunctions or police action. I mean, look at what's happening with the Wet'suwet'en, and look what's happening with 1492 Land Back Lane. Look what happened with the Big Mouth fishers who were going lobster fishing out off the coast of Nova Scotia. You know, I can give you lots of examples from the past and the present where, you know, assertion of rights is being challenged, trying to be contained and until it's eliminated, right? That's the objective of these agreements.
Right.
Because as a member of a community, like as a band member of a band, if your band signs an agreement and it passes a referendum, it affects you as an individual, because the Crown will say, the governments will say, well, your community agreed to this. So you're part of the community, so you're stuck with it, right? They went into a land code under the First Nations Land Management Act. So you can't take your property on reserve and try and say you're going to do what you want with it, because it's going to be part of whatever the land code is, the zoning and that. And that's all going to lead to, they're working on a thing after the First Nations Land Management Act. They've been working on what's called the First Nations Property Ownership Initiative. They now call it the Indigenous Land Title Initiative. But what it is they want to privatize residential lands on reserve into fee simple. And not regular fee simple, but a form of fee simple where you can sell and trade those lands to other community members or to the band government. And they're already kind of doing that in the land claims, like the Nisga'a Treaty. In the Nisga'a Treaty, they have property tax. And if you don't pay your property tax, your individual lands can go up to auction and be sold. But only other Nisga'a members can buy it, or the Nisga'a government can buy it. And they've been doing that. They've been auctioning off lands to people that didn't pay their property tax. And that's kind of where it's going to head under self-government, right? It's going to be the same thing. The revenue generation that you know, Rolland was talking about is going to have to include taxation. And already they're starting to bring it in under water fees and things like that. They don't call it taxes. They call it fees. I know in Kahnawake, they're charging fees for services, right? Because the government, you know, is basically pulling out. They used to provide services. Now they're saying, well, you gotta pay for that yourself. So they're kind of incrementally slipping it in and getting you used, training you to accept fees and service fees and things like that. They don't call it taxes, but eventually it'll be called tax, property tax. And then of course you'll be paying sales tax and income tax, because once your status changes, under the modern treaties, they have to do that. They pay income tax, they pay property tax, they pay sales tax. You don't have any tax exemption, as they say.
So in the interest of covering all the ground that we need to cover, I think it would be best to leave the questions for the end and you know, try to move on to the next, if it's okay with you guys. In 2015, Justin Trudeau and his Liberal Party were elected with a majority government. The Liberal platform included many major promises to Indigenous peoples, meaning First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Some of the major promises of the Trudeau Liberals were a new relationship based on reconciliation, a nation-to-nation process, enacting all 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Lifting the 2% cap on First Nations funding, a full review of federal law and policy in full partnership with First Nations, establish an Indigenous missing women and girls inquiry. How have these promises been implemented over the past 6 years?
I think we talked about most of those, except the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Commission. Because we talked about the fiscal policies, you know, we talked about self-government, we talked about them dissolving Indian Affairs and creating 2 new departments.
Yeah, we jumped around. What
Yeah,
can we
so
talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous women?
well, they came up with a report, right? Remember, they said that Canada was still committing genocide. And when they issued their final report, that's what all the settler media focused on was genocide. They argued, no, you can't be saying we're committing genocide in Canada. But they said the federal policy still amounted to attacking Indigenous women, girls, and families, and that amounted to genocide. And they had to put out a special volume defining what they meant by the term genocide. And the media didn't really cover all the recommendations in there. And the federal government was supposed to come up with an action plan a year later to respond to that. And I think they may have just started to say that they were releasing an action plan soon, or they just did one after the 2021 election. So I don't think they've really even acted on that. It's another one of those promises, that they made and they really haven't fulfilled yet. And even the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The thing I'd say about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is those of us that were around to see it formed, you'd remember this, Rolland. Remember they had Harry LaForme and they had a couple of other commissioners before Murray Sinclair. And they were fighting amongst themselves, and then they got replaced, and it became Murray Sinclair and Willie Littlechild and Stephen Cackfuy's wife, I forget her name, from the Northwest Territories. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that AFN under Phil Fontaine negotiated. And they had 4 parts to it. And one part was an apology from the Prime Minister. One part was the common experience payments, which kind of had 2 parts to it. If you were abused, there was a second stage you had to go through where you had to prove you were abused. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was one of the promises. And they narrowed the terms of reference. The mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't give them subpoena powers or powers to go after priests or nuns or staff that were involved in residential schools that could be charged. It was really, in a lot of ways, it was a toothless body, but it was part of the out-of-court settlement under the Indian Residential School Settlement Act, or Agreement, sorry. And that's why Stephen Harper made that apology, because it was a court-ordered apology, even though he had an onion in his pocket or something and teared up. And, the apology was part of the deal, just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So when they issued their 94 calls to action, I always thought that the calls to action were not sufficient to address the racism and colonialism that still exists in Canadian society today. I mean, and that's the other thing I guess I'd say is with the mass burials that have been found, like in Kamloops and the other schools, and they're still searching, doing ground penetration searches for more sites. That's been taken up a lot of the focus, but I always remember, just like residential schools themselves, it's all part of a broader system of colonialism. Residential schools were part of the Indian Act. And really, it's only the tip of the iceberg of what we've experienced through the Indian Act, because the Indian Act forced us into a stage of underdevelopment for over 140 some years, where we were forced onto the reserve system and settlers surrounded us, and became provinces and enriched themselves off of our lands, territories, and resources. And anytime our people tried to do something economically, the government would shut us down. I remember a historian sent me this document from the 1830s about Kahnawake. They were complaining to the colonial government officials, the French farmers from Chateauguay, which is next to Kahnawake. Mm-hmm. And they were selling pig manure for fertilizer in the market at a lower price than the French farmers. And the French farmers were complaining about that to the colonial authorities. They wanted them to stop the Mohawks from being able to go there and sell that product. So that's what I always tell people from home. I said, they didn't even want us to sell shit. So don't worry about the tobacco or anything else, because they just don't want us to compete, with their surrounding economies. And, that's the whole thing about the Indian Act. It had much broader impacts than residential schools. And although it's horrible finding the mass burial sites and stuff, and the residential schools are horrible, I think we have to look at the bigger picture, like the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women's Inquiry said, is that it's genocide that's being committed even today. Not in the past, but in 2022, because their policies to dismember our families and our communities are still in place. I mean, Rolland just laid out a bunch of them in land claims and self-government. Those policies are all designed to really dismember us as nations into becoming ethnic minorities, within Canada. Indigenous Canadians, just like Italian Canadians or, French Canadians, whatever, hyphenated Canadians. That's where we're going to wind up the way things are going if we sign these agreements. And it looks like, and that's the problem, is the people don't know these negotiations are in secret until the chief and council say, well, we have an agreement with the government. We need to have a referendum to vote on whether you accept it or not. And then the yes side gets all the money and the lawyers and the advisors and the communication strategy to sell the agreement, because the feds fund that because they want a yes vote. But the no side, anybody that can read the agreement, say, wait a minute, this isn't a good agreement for us. They don't get any support at all. They're just individuals who are then discredited as being naysayers and trying to stop the deal kind of thing.
Right.
That's how come the yes votes are always supported from the federal side, no matter what it is in the referendums. But once there's a referendum held and the community votes on it, and if the majority say yeah, and then they lower the thresholds, right? Like they're doing a review now of the Indian Act referendum regulations. I sent that around. They use the Indian Act referendum regulations for the referendums on self-government agreements or land claim settlements and things like that. They use those rules to hold a referendum. But now they're saying they want to modernize it. And that means they want to allow for online voting. Meanwhile, they've been allowing for voting on land codes, for example, to go down to, what is it, Rolland, 25% of the population?
Yeah, as low as 25. Actually, they want it. It's gone to the point where just a majority of those voting.
Yeah.
So if 10 people vote and a majority of those agree to go along with it, it's lowering the standard of approval. And I always try to tell community people, anytime they're bringing up a vote, a referendum, rights are at stake. Something's involved.
Yeah.
It's not properly explained, but that's the signal. As soon as they want to vote, something's up.
And that's the Indian standard, because the white standard is 50% plus one. No white community would ever accept anything less than 50% plus one in any referendum or any vote. But for Indians, it's okay to reduce it.
Yeah. That's what amazes me, is that as soon as the court established that high standards of conduct apply to the Crown's handling of our affairs, they start lowering the standards all the time, even on fiduciary. How can you do that? And the other thing is, there's a lot of confusion between individual rights and collective rights. Our rights are recognized as collective rights, and like land rights it's a collective. It's not one person in the band that controls everything or owns everything or has the band as a whole. All the members collectively have an interest in those lands or any other asset. And British common law, I remember at the UN talking with a UK official who said, well, in the international legal arena, we're not used to dealing with collective rights beyond labor rights. And so it's a new field that is not fully fleshed out in terms of what are collective rights. But certainly Canada's constitutional framework provides for collective rights like Quebec and like First Nations, but we don't seem to be entitled to the same standards. And that's a very important aspect, I think, that gets lost, because individual rights are about these property rights and individual freedoms and so forth, but they tend to ignore the collective nature of the rights, and they want to reduce us to just simply being Indigenous individuals rather than Indigenous nations. And
That's the new rule for the Indigenous Services Canada. Their mandates for Indigenous individuals and provide services to them. education, health, and so forth, or Indigenous governing bodies, which are those band councils.
Yeah.
Indigenous governments are Section 35 entities.
I can't believe the wording on a lot of this stuff that has gone through, and our people allegedly have approved it. And I don't see where that approval was obtained. And for instance, when they promised to do a review of all the law to make sure it's all consistent with their own constitution, let alone the UN Declaration. I thought this would be, I thought consultation, should involve the people. Even the Royal Commission paper was talking about that our nations need a chance to reassemble themselves. We need that resources as well as opportunity to do that, and that's never happened. So I don't see they've been able to push this thing through because the dilemma has been let's get rid of the Indian Act, and they're using the Indian Act. Yes, they're saying it's colonial and all this, but what they're doing is a recolonization, making us subject to federal jurisdiction. That we don't have any inherent authority. Our authority only comes from federal delegation under federal laws. So that's
assumed crown sovereignty. That's what they call it.
Yeah. So I think we should be thinking about challenging this crown sovereignty and its assertion. And because they're not following their own law, especially in terms of fiduciary, because the behavior and the, I don't know if it's called sophistry or trickery, but it's certainly what's referred to in the royal, isn't it the Royal Proclamation that refers to great frauds and abuses?
Yeah.
Committed against our friends, the Indian nations. And this was supposed to help eliminate great frauds and abuses, but now we have the crown is the one instigating the great frauds and abuses, I think. But we don't have legal counsel that's going to pursue these issues, it doesn't appear. And the ones that do appear seem to be wingnuts. So it's very difficult to, it causes further confusion amongst the people.
Yeah,
So
the
we can't-
wingnuts.
Yeah, it's very difficult to have a decent discussion, because I think the specific claims taught me a lot about the lower standards. And for instance, compound interest should be applied, but they've avoided it like the plague. And I guess the clenched defalcation case established that no, this is a breach of fiduciary and it requires compound interest, and the law of equity is also excluded, and so I think all these things are prejudicial. They're racist. The denial of our inherent rights can only be seen as a.
But the problem is, Rolland, if our leadership is co-opted into going along with this, and they're the ones who are the recognized authorities by the governments and corporations, right? Those are the ones that negotiate with the corporations coming onto our territories.
Yeah.
Our people don't really have a chance. And also, I hear, well, if they do it, we can take them to court. But that's kind of frivolous, because who's going to be able to afford, which bands do you know that can afford to go to court under these legal tests that the Supreme Court has laid out, which cost tens of millions of dollars to collect the cultural and historical evidence, let alone to sustain the, the court costs. Because a lot of times, if it's a fundamental Aboriginal or treaty right, it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And that takes 10 years, plus tens of millions of dollars. Where's the justice in that? And the government knows this, and they routinely take advantage of that, at the negotiating table, or if we don't go along, then they criminalize us, or they try and do character assassinations of leaders that are challenging them, to try and sideline them or take them out. That's what they've always done, right? They've always tried to sideline our leaders that stand up to them, right? And they're still doing that today. They're trying to isolate them, right? And there's so many that are willing to go along. It looks like the majority are willing to go along.
Yeah,
Our
That's
people
what
are
they've
going to be
always
in
been
for a
able-
tough time.
that's what they've always been able to use, as long as they work, but there's always somebody willing to go along with them. And they'll use that as the shining example of, they used to call it, at one point, they called it the champions strategy.
Yeah, the champions, yeah.
Yeah, where they would go, and then Ron Irwin was pretty blatant about it. He would, name drop at every meeting. He'd say, "Oh, well, Chief so-and-so said
Yeah.
this, and agrees with this." And,
The good chiefs,
yeah,
not the bad
so,
chiefs.
and the parallels throughout history are amazingly consistent.
That's why I say the bureaucracy is the permanent government, because they just keep training each generation of bureaucrats, to keep their thumb on us.
Yeah,
With better and better communication strategies. I have to say, I have to give the Liberals good marks for communications, because their propaganda is very good. They've tricked our people. They tricked a lot of our leaders. But then once you get into those tables, if you're still going along, then you're going along with it. You're not being tricked anymore.
Yeah.
You're co-opted, right?
and that's why when it comes time for a vote on accepting agreements, the leadership that negotiated it is already invested in it.
Yeah,
Obviously, they want to see it pass. But what I've seen in some communities with these new alternatives, which is on a smaller scale, is that there's no transparency that's even required in the legislation, and the government officials aren't ensuring that the conditions in the legislation is met. They're allowing things to go. What did that one reporter tell us? It's like they're throwing all the people under the bus.
yeah.
Big deals with chiefs and councils, and the people really have no say. It's an amazing. I never thought I would see chiefs and councils be so slippery with their own people. I mean, there's always been sleazebags around, but
Some of them are even running for liberal MP
Yeah.
positions.
no kidding. So they're promoting. That's why I've never voted in federal elections. I've always been against it because we have treaties with them. Why would we want to vote in their elections when, and that's why I thought if we reached a settlement, because the AFN, and when they were working on the constitutional provisions, used to call it completing the circle of confederation. And, us being a third order of government, we used to talk about. But as Russ says now, we've become a fourth order under the provinces and
Lower than municipalities, yeah.
Yeah, because their laws can override us if we're not smart. So it's a pretty tricky world that's been created, and I hope we're not confusing people. But because you name any policy, any agreement, and we can point out where all these shortcomings are. And most obvious of all, though, is the lack of process in the communities of discussion amongst the people. And so I think the Idle No More movement was a great reaction, but I didn't know it was coming at such a crucial time just before the final solution was introduced by Trudeau, who's, obviously the wolf in sheep's clothing because he makes everything sound good, but what in fact they've done is enabled the bureaucracy to run loose with the plans the bureaucracy has been developing since 1969. They allowed them they gave them license to complete it and impose it. And people don't see it. They tried to, the government reacted to Russ's pamphlet on white paper 2, and they only proved his point. They're trying to deny that it's part of the white paper framework, but obviously it is. And it's not the direction we envisioned, I don't think, when the chiefs, for the most part, except the exception we talked about earlier, but Treaty 6 in Alberta, supported the adoption of Section 35. And now I see the young people see Section 35 as being a weapon against us.
Well, don't forget Eric Robinson and Henry Bird Quinney out of Manitoba wrote that book, The Infested Blanket, when Section 35, when the new Constitution was adopted. So they were against Section 35 too. In
Yeah,
fact, there was a coalition of First Nations that were opposed to the patriation, and they protested outside of the where the First Ministers Conference was being held in 1983. Because I went into that conference as a media person, and they were protesting outside against what was going on inside the building. But then by 1984, they were gone. They were all part of the process. So it
Yeah,
lasted
people-
1 year.
yeah. Once you get the expense accounts and the positions, you know, commission positions and, you know, all manner of positions they give out now to First Nation
Inducements.
people. Inducements, yeah. It makes it appear to the media and the general public as if we're getting somewhere when in fact we're losing our inherent rights. And
So maybe I get to a couple of questions, if that's good with you guys.
Yeah.
please,
Yeah, Kevin Morin says, has anyone followed up on the late Arthur Manuel's work? I loved his ideas on involving the UN on underlying title. And we know about Arthur's work on proprietary interest. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, Russ.
The short answer is no. I mean, Art was doing so many things that no one person could follow up. You know, Art and I kind of had a division of labor between us where I focused on what was happening in Ottawa and domestically with constitutional issues, and he would focus on what was going on in international fora, and he would travel internationally to UN meetings and to other countries, you know, advocating for rights, because he created his own organization called the Indigenous Network on Economies and Trade, INET, not to be confused with Skynet and Terminator, but INET. And he was doing that work right up until when he passed. And I believe his children are in charge of INET now, but I don't think they're as active on the international stage as he was. In fact, I've gone to some international meetings since he passed to try and do some of the work he was doing. But Art had his own network of people too. You know, when Art was alive, he had a lot of people volunteering and helping him. He had a huge global network. He had an international network. And I don't know who they all were, but, you know, Art was always good at attracting people and then convincing them to do stuff for him. You know, parceling out tasks. He was very good at that. But I would say his work needs to be followed up on, but, you know, I personally don't have the resources because I'm just one person.
yeah. He
Same with
actually,
the others.
as an example, he went to the international ratings agencies like Standards and Poor
Yeah,
and informed them that you're rating provinces, giving them ratings without taking account of the liabilities.
in Canada too.
Yeah. So I
Yeah,
think
he was
that-
saying they shouldn't be getting AAA ratings for borrowing money when they have liabilities, outstanding liabilities to First Nations, you know, in terms of outstanding title and outstanding treaty issues. You know, that's the proprietary interest stuff, where he was saying that Canada is by using Indigenous stolen lands, territories, and resources, Indigenous peoples are subsidizing Canada's economy through unfair trade subsidies. And a lot of the chiefs are too chicken to bring those kind of arguments up that Art did. But Art got standing at the binational panel on the free trade agreement, you know, on the softwood lumber. He got involved in the softwood lumber fight. He went down to the US and Washington, D.C. and was fighting Canada with US interests, pointing out that, you know, Canada was getting, you know, because none of the profits of the treaties coming off of treaty lands or Aboriginal title lands were going to First Nations. So the cost of the softwood lumber, you know, it wasn't benefiting the people whose territory it was coming off of. Even after the Delgamuukw decision, he was using the Delgamuukw decision. And he also got standing with the World Trade Organization, the WTO, they granted him standing to make an intervention there too, to make that same argument about Indigenous rights forming unfair trade subsidies to, countries that are not giving benefits back to the Indian nations, whose territories they're exploiting natural resources off of. So he was doing advanced work, I don't know of anybody else that was doing that kind of work than him. And he was talking with guys like Joseph Stiglitz, I think his name was, that economist for Bill Clinton. Like he was talking to a lot of high level people on these ideas who were supportive of him. But yeah, I don't know of anybody following up on that. You certainly wouldn't see AFN or a lot of the provincial organizations doing that, because they'd be afraid of their funding getting cut by the governments for raising those issues.
And it would get cut too.
Yeah, probably would get cut, yeah. But Art had his own organization, so it wasn't government funded, so he wasn't censored, They couldn't shut him down or shut him up. And he had a big effect. But I think it would take an organization, a new organization being formed to take up the work that he was doing as an individual.
Yeah, because it was on economics rather than human rights he focused on.
Yeah.
Which was really, I think, great work. And Indigenous peoples as a whole have opened up the UN as a forum, I think, and paved the way for what they call civil society to have more impact on policy development in that international agency. But as we see, Canada or United States or countries just, if they don't like what the UN is doing, they undermine its credibility. But when they want to use it, they'll use it, just like they do with everything else.
Well, take, for example, the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Canada was supposed to go appear before them just this last year in 2021, because they ignored the recommendation from CERD, as it's called, telling them they should stop those pipelines in BC, one of which is Canada's pipeline. Canada owns TMX pipeline. And they told them to stop until there was free, prior, informed consent from the Shuswaps. And they didn't stop, they ignored that. So they were told that they have to come and report to the committee as to what they're doing about that. And Canada asked for a delay for 1 year. So they were supposed to go this year. And so now it's not going to be until 2023. So they're manipulating too the UN system to try and avoid having to report. In the meantime, they're going to try and settle it on the ground through police raids and all that, right? Arrest, criminalization, on the Wet'suwet'en, for example, or the Tiny House Warriors, who are trying to block the TMX pipeline.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're up against a big machine.
Yeah. They take out the opposition and deal with the people that will deal with them, and they always find them.
And now they seem to be the majority.
Yeah.
So Victoria King would like to know, please define compound interest. What is this? Where does this come from?
It's the laws surrounding compensation, the provision of compensation. And in specific claims especially is where they wanted to avoid equity and compound interest, because especially breach of fiduciary is a very important. If the legal concept is valid, then they should be following the law. And when there's a breach of fiduciary, all these highest standards are supposed to be applied by the courts. And in compensation, compound interest changes the whole perspective on compensation. It means that if the original damage was done 100 years ago, compounding the interest more than triples compensation. So I got to get my cord, but it's an important principle. And it's just one example of how they try to circumvent or undermine legal principles that would apply. if it's going to penalize them more, you know.
In land claims negotiations.
Yeah, I forgot to complete my point earlier about when they used to discount claim settlement offers. They would say, well, they called it degree of doubt. That was Rembo Westland when he used to be the director there. And so what they would do is they say, well, we will estimate what your chances of winning in court on this would have been. And if we think they're 70%, we'll offer you 70% compensation. So it was just another part of the way these officials think.
The sharp
Because
dealing.
Yeah, even land claim settlements, there was officials within the finance section that thought that would be a good opportunity to get, if the band owed something to the department, they could recover it there. But that got excluded eventually, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them bring that
It
kind
got
of stuff
excluded
back.
because some of the bands went to the United Nations and started pointing it out. And so
Mm-hmm.
Canada backed off.
Yeah. But you know, they're there ready to, they got all the Sharpies and justice ready to assist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
But those are, I hope that addresses the question about compound interest, because you know,
yes,
it can change that compensation package from 3 to 10 times as much, you know, because you're talking about the loss over generations.
becomes unquantifiable.
Yeah. And I don't see why the principle shouldn't apply in a breach of fiduciary. That's what I mean by lowering standards. I mean, we're talking about, Russ and I, they're always lowering the standards for Indigenous people.
Right.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It is racist.
Yeah.
So Daryl asked the question, what can I do if my band keeps my treaty payment from me or other members in my community because they want to invest? They want to invest it into something else like the 10-year program.
Is that
Anybody?
10-year program? Is that the 10-year grant?
That's what I'm wondering.
Is that the $5?
Some it's only $4.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we have enough information to answer that question.
Yeah, because there was the Robinson Huron annuities case, which because the Robinson Huron was before the numbered treaties, they perfected their approach after the Robinson treaties because it had an escalator clause in the Robinson treaties that said the annuity would be changed in accordance with provincial revenues. So that was a pretty important case.
So Isaac just asked, or not just, but treaty annuities, will that be lost by band signing FNFMA?
FNA.
Is that the
First Nations fiscal, oh, they spelled it wrong and I said it.
okay?
I said what they spelled.
The First Nations Fiscal Management Act, going into that.
Exactly, First Nations Fiscal Management Act.
I'll be right back. Gotta get my cord.
I don't know if it would directly affect the treaty annuity payments because what the First Nations Fiscal Management Act is about is setting up a real property tax system on reserve. And if you're into the First Nations Land Management Act, it's linked together with the land code. And the land code, you know, registers individual interests on what used to be a reserve, but under you're opting out of the Indian Act into the Land Management Act. So your land code, if you bring the taxation system, it could then move to taxing individual properties on the reserve. Also, one of the Indian referendum regulation they want to modernize to allow online voting. That's also used for, I'll probably make this a little more complicated. The Indian Act used to have a provision in there where if you wanted to have a non-native business on the reserve, you had to surrender that parcel of land, you know, so that the non-native business could operate on that land. But in 1988, through the Kamloops Amendment, led by Manny Jules, who was chief there, they changed the wording from surrender to designation. So you could designate a parcel of the reserve for economic development purposes, like a 99-year lease. Like I know, for example, one band in Alberta wanted to designate land for a casino for a 99-year lease. And they held a vote and the people voted against it because the band council wasn't giving information to the members about the business side of the proposal. So it got voted down. So they held another vote and the no side won on that again. So the land designations is part of the Indian Act, but I don't think it survives under the land code. That, it depends on what your code says. And so I don't think the question is about the treaty annuities. I don't think that stuff affects the treaty annuities directly. Unless you go into a self-government agreement, then I don't know. It would depend on the terms, because the self-government agreements, which is the ultimate goal of all these steps, right? The Land Management Act, Fiscal Management Act, those are just steps leading to self-government. In fact, the federal government considers the Land Management Act and the Fiscal Management Act as sectoral self-government agreements. They say that themselves. They say the Land Management Act is a sectoral self-government agreement. But a full or comprehensive self-government agreement would be like a constitution and a new arrangement where you become this municipal corporation that can buy and sell land and do, pass certain laws and stuff. That's the goal. I don't know how that's going to affect treaties and treaty annuities. It's going to depend on the terms of your self-government agreement. And there's national principles and standards that they're applying. That's why I talked about that federal steering committee, because this all comes from cabinet mandates. The cabinet makes a mandate to negotiate. And if they can give a mandate to negotiate across the country, sometimes the negotiators will come back and get a specific negotiating mandate for a particular band. And it depends on the facts of what they're trying to negotiate. Because in the end, like Rolland said, the whole objective of these negotiations is to try and limit Crown liability into the future, right? They're trying to reduce their obligations or eliminate them or replace them, Really, it's a replacement strategy where your treaty relationship is replaced with a new relationship in the self-government agreement. So I'm not a lawyer, I'm a policy analyst, but I would say you'd have to look at the terms and conditions of the self-government agreement, because I think that's where your relationship is really changed.
Right.
Because it's a whole new relationship once you go into self-government.
More of a corporate relationship.
Yeah. But I don't know, the question was about annuities. Does that affect annuities? Like the Fiscal Management Act, does that affect annuities? And I said, I don't believe it would.
The Fiscal Management Act, an interesting intersection with the Land Management Act, is one of the last clauses in the First Nation Land Management Act says that you can invoke and become part of the the Fiscal Management Act by simply notifying membership. I think it's 4 or 6 weeks. And you can be under the Fiscal Management Act without any referendum or discussion. It's just simply
I've had people contact me and say that they didn't realize that their band was listed on the schedule of the Fiscal Management Act or the Land Management Act, because you can go and look up the First Nations Land Management Act online, and there's a schedule attached to it, and it says lists all the bands that are under that act. Same with the Fiscal Management Act. You can go and look that up, and there's a schedule attached. And they've got 2 lists. One is a development and one that have developed tax systems. Because you kind of enter it, there's a developmental phase, and then there's a final one. Anyways, they list the bands that are under those acts. So if you want to know if your band is under there, that's what you got to do.
And the reason they have these published online is because they're like public corporations that have to be accountable to the public, or at least their frameworks.
Yeah, it's federal legislation, so they're subject to federal rules.
Yeah.
We'll try to post some of those links. A statement worth mentioning here is from Georgina Underwood. And she says, I think actions now are so important because I believe not only are they creating the laws to govern our unceded territories and will begin land grabs everywhere. On the West Coast here, they are infiltrating and selling off islands inherent territories which are used by many families and determine our territories, our land and sea base. We were migratory and mariners, and much of that was stolen from us.
Yep. Well, out in BC, they do have, in 2019, they passed the Recognition and Reconciliation for Treaty Negotiations policy with the First Nations Summit, because the First Nations Summit represents all the groups that are in the BC Treaty Commission process. They excluded the Union of BC Indian Chiefs in developing that policy because the Union of BC Indian Chiefs always opposed the BCTC process. So they developed it with the government. The First Nations Summit developed that policy with the governments of BC and Canada, and it's online. You can look that policy up, and it's still based on de facto extinguishment. Section 18 of that policy says the purpose of the policy is to reconcile pre-existing Indigenous sovereignty with the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. And so that clip you played of Joe Wild at the beginning, that's what he says, right? If it's not in the agreement, it's extinguished, right? So, and the government has preconditions to those negotiations, so it's pretty tightly controlled.
And that's what they changed. Instead of having those surrender clauses, now it says, they call it the setting aside provisions. They did two things, and the cabinet document was leaked to us at the time. It was being done for the
Dog rib?
the dog rib agreement. And they, instead of saying cede, release, and surrender these lands, it says you will have no other constitutionally protected rights except what is provided for in this agreement. So that's a form of extinguishment. Because, and for their own safety, they added what they call a fallback provision, which says that if in future the courts define Indigenous rights or inherent rights in some different way from the agreement, you will not have access to that because you're bound by the agreement. So it is a form of extinguishment, but it's just took out the language that is more obvious.
It's
But
the Department of
lawyers
Justice lawyers,
Yeah, I remember lawyers telling me, though, they don't know how effective that clause would ultimately be if it was challenged.
Of course, that's assuming that somebody has the money to go to court and mount the evidence.
Yeah.
That's what the government's counting on, is most of the people are going to be impoverished even after signing these agreements. Because it's not giving you a big windfall of money.
Here's a good question. Victoria says, what difference would it make for non-Indigenous people to know about the treaties in Canada/US, that treaty relationship? Non-Indigenous people must know about the treaties, because why?
Well, I think number one, so they can understand the relationship that First Nations have and the understanding of treaty relations that is not the same as the Crown's interpretation. The spirit and intent of treaties needs to be explained. And I think, Canada had no real treaty policy for, complying with treaty relationships. What they had was a program to establish these so-called treaty commissioners that is really about public education. That's what they're about. So it allows the First Nations to do research and so forth and publicize their own interpretations, but it doesn't accomplish anything legally in terms of.
But the problem that I see with that is most of the treaty leadership are at Trudeau's tables. So I don't think they're going to be arguing about an interpretation of their treaty rights outside of their tables unless they don't get an agreement. Then they probably would go public and say, how what the government's pushing doesn't fit with their interpretation. But that would affect the ability to do any public education. The chiefs would take control of that. And if they're at tables, they're going to want to raise those issues at the table, I think, not in the public. Just practically speaking. I don't know if you agree, Rolland, but we've seen this picture before.
Yeah. Well, I think the traditional understanding, of the elders and knowledge keepers of various nations have been completely undermined and are becoming not very relevant, unfortunately. And we're reaching a time where they're calling people like Russ and I elders, and that's not, that wasn't our expectation or our intent, because we had traditional knowledge keepers. We have in some.
Yeah, we're just old.
Fortunately, we still have, some, but we need to work with them as much as possible. That's one thing I believe, that people need to record as much as their traditional knowledge as they can. For instance, Fred Kelly, his brother told me, Peter Kelly, when I was up in their reserve there in Lake of the Woods, where the Medewan has been preserved and is very strong, a traditional medicine society. But the Medewan used to be against having anything written down or recorded, and this is almost 20 years ago now. Their view changed, and I've heard this in other contexts where they realized that the knowledge is slipping away, it's being lost, and so now they are understanding that they need to record and need to sometimes codify laws or the principles and so forth. They're going to be lost if they're not recorded. So I think that kind of work can go hand in hand with land claims research or land use studies and
Land
so
rights.
forth. Yeah, but it needs to be a part of it. And it needs to be respected more so than just having elders being that like a priest, and they come in and say the prayer and then you go ahead with whatever you want to do or say. I think it needs to be brought back into more meaning and more application to the discussions. If indeed that's the position, that the spirit and intent of treaties must be respected, then you need those people that understand the spirit and intent of the treaty to be explaining.
That's what I've been telling community leaders and people that I talk to is, I'm saying, like it or not, the court has put the burden of proof on us. And even if our intention is not to go into court, if we go and do, exercise our inherent rights, our treaty rights, we might come in conflict with the law and we might be charged. And then we're going to need that evidence to protect us, to defend our position. So I say we have to collect the cultural and historical evidence, on how the Crown's treated us, but also, use that evidence for the kids, for education and stuff, not just for litigation or negotiation, but you need it for those purposes. And you also need to do computer mapping of your territory, layers of information like forest cover, where mines are proposed or have been, where the roads are, where your traditional transportation routes are, where your hunting, fishing, and trapping sites are. Map biographies of all the adult members in your community are very important. Land use and occupancy mapping, because that's a way for you to mark out the areas that are important to you from industrial activities happening on your lands that the province or the feds might be permitting or authorizing. And then you need to take that information and do a strategic plan to protect your territory and to preserve your identity and culture into the future and your connection to the land. Because, everything's modernized. Even forest management is a computer model. They're doing virtual projections of regrowth of forests, 50, 100 years ahead. And I've worked with communities that have had to interject their own information in order to protect their sites, their culture. They had to change the model, the computer model. They had to become familiar with that stuff because they know the bush, right? They know the land. They can go out there and trap a beaver and hunt.
But habitat
Yeah.
protection.
Yeah, they know all that stuff. But what they have to do is figure out how the forest industry is designing and cutting their trees and their plans for replanting and all that. So there's all this high tech stuff that's happening in all the provinces. And if our people don't get the younger people involved to get the skills to merge, what the elders know with the skills of doing information management, databases and archives, because the governments and corporations have these things. If we don't have the same tools to take our knowledge and our history and our culture, and use these modern tools to defend ourselves with, we're just going to go down community by community like they're trying to force us into. But if you collect all that information and you can use that back on the province and the federal government, because you know your history and culture, you know your connection to the land, you know how it's been alienated because of government actions, permits and licenses, and you can go and argue that. And even when you go to the United Nations for a human rights complaint, Rolland will tell you, you need evidence to show how you were treated by the state. So you need this evidence anyway, no matter what you do. So that's what I tell people. And in fact, in my website, I have a vision in there where I lay out kind of the components of doing self-determination plans. RussDiabo.com, if you look there, you see my vision. And that's what I was saying is, every community has to do their own plan, which is research, mapping, and planning. And we have to do it outside. Otherwise, we're just going to be sucked into Ottawa's national plan. That's what's happening. If you want an alternative to what Ottawa's termination plan is, you got to develop your own plan. And you need information to do that.
Yeah.
If you want to have free, prior, informed consent, the key thing is informed, which means information. You can't have free, prior, informed consent without information. That's what I say.
And building consensus is so important in communities. The only communities that have achieved pushing the envelope on our rights are the ones who have been able to take action because they were united. Divisions undermine that. And I find in the communities, a lot of the division comes down to the personality conflicts that go on within rural and isolated communities, where people don't talk to each other, or they're prejudiced against each other within the community. If one guy is saying something, well, I'm not going to listen to him.
Or family fights.
Yeah, and those things can affect building consensus, and we need to overcome those things. And I find one of the most destructive things in our communities, I know it used to be a form of social control, is gossip, but there is very damaging gossip that goes on that undermines building consensus and working together as a community. And we have to start recognizing that there's a greater force out there that we need to be concerned with, rather than what Joe did. It's what Justin did. So I think we need to start looking at it that way, rather than Joe next door. It's more Justin on the hill. So I think we need to think about those principles in the declaration and see how. Some of them were for the states, right? Respecting the territorial integrity of states. That was obviously a state.
Article 46.1. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, but also the right to self-determination. Don't forget what it means. It means a people may not be deprived of their means of subsistence, and a people have a right to choose their own political affiliation. And that's what I thought we were trying to do in Canada, is to establish our affiliation with Canada. I don't think most First Nations were against being associated and being part of Canada, but we wanted to be a part of Canada on our own terms, based on our pre-existing inherent rights. But that's starting to look very, very remote under the current policies.
Idealistic.
Yeah, idealistic, when it's really basic human rights.
Mm-hmm.
And the economic rights is so important, because that's part of it. We have a right to an economy, and we shouldn't have to be using limited reserve lands as our only capital when we have traditional territories. If we want to be capitalists, fine, but we have to have access to capital. We can't do it with that. It amazes me how they've been able to turn the tables and make us capitalize our reserve lands, turning them from collective holdings to this idea of private property, which is, I don't think appropriate in traditional communities, or in terms of Indigenous rights. We have to find a balance, but it's very difficult under the current trends to find that balance between traditional values and modern economics. We have to recognize I mean, it's a materialistic society, and the economy. I just think if we're going to be participants in that, we should be able to choose our own relationship to it, rather than being dictated to and told how it will happen.
Coerced.
Yeah, coerced. Without people even knowing that they're being coerced, I don't think. All they know is they want a better life for their people. And what's happening on so many reserves across the country with the opiate addictions and overdoses and suicides, I'm surprised it's not seen as a national crisis, because I know just on my reserve, I thought it was happening. It's not even a news item. And then I find out the neighboring communities are going through the same thing. I mean, talk about suicide epidemic. It's just incredible. If these, I think maybe I wish I was young and could get into the demographics, because that's what we used to utilize. In the old days, there was the Hawthorne report, which showed all the statistical measures where Indian people fell way below the national standards. And they seem to have made things so that we can't show that anymore easily. And I think some demographic work needs to be done as well on these conditions that are happening, because it used to be alcohol was the big problem, but it seems that it's been surpassed by the drug situation. And I don't think following faulty models like the war against drugs is going to be the solution, because obviously that's failed globally. And we have to start finding the proper solutions. And I think our people, based on our collective values and those things we say inform our identity, that's where the answers lie in looking at these issues as symptomatic of what's, they're all symptoms of deprivation, of genocide. It can be shown, or ethnocide. I think these things are not being explored enough between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. I see discussions going on amongst non-Indigenous peoples about these issues in the absence of Indigenous participation, and then the discussions are taking place in amongst Indigenous peoples, and we're not connecting these dots properly. But I think it can be done. And I think a younger generation, I know there's elements that are demanding justice and so forth, but it's justice is a fleeting term, and
an expensive one.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it gets very difficult when you have to quantify your rights in terms of monetary values. But I think if we start talking about jurisdiction and those kind of issues, then we're talking, the real stuff, but not delegated jurisdiction. It must be inherent.
If I may, I'll throw out another question. This is from Georgina Underwood. What do you think of the actions regarding rights of nature, for example, salmon water and their ecosystems having inherent rights to be protected? Water has rights in New Zealand, US. Water belongs to the children. So I guess I don't know how to respond to that.
Well, that's our traditional laws, right? I mean, we looked at all of nature as having rights. We were part of it, right? But like Rolland just said, we're in a capitalist industrial system. All of our communities are surrounded by provinces that are developing the resources.
But can we get
and-
laws passed to implement what has always been our natural way? Rights to the water, water having inherent rights in and of itself.
We're just talking about basic survival. Rolland was just going through and talking about the suicide and the opioid epidemics, the drug epidemics. Our people aren't in ability, to really organize to save themselves, let alone nature.
And meanwhile, there's a debate going on at the UN about privatizing water, which they've done in states like South Africa, where they used to have a public standpipe. Now it's a vending machine. That's incredible.
Yeah, they're commodifying it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think we have to be practical about what we can and can't do. And I think it has to be done community by community. We can't say that there's a national standard or approach, because that's what Ottawa's doing. Ottawa's imposing national standards, regardless of whether you're a Cree, a Mohawk, an Ojibwe, a Odawa, whatever. It's a national standard. And they're using, and the reason why when they did the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, they called it the Common Experience Payment, was because everybody it didn't matter which nation you were from, you had the common experience of being forced into residential schools. Yep. And the Indian Act is the same thing. We all have the common experience of our communities being forced into underdevelopment by the Indian Act and controlled by the government, the departmental officials and the minister. Like 75% of the Indian Act is totally under the control of the department. It's discretionary what we can do. And that's still the case in 2022 as it was in 1876. They still define us and control us through the money. It's really the money that they control us with, right? For programs and services, education, social assistance, that's all the stuff under Indigenous Services Canada now. So now they're controlling that for Indigenous individuals and, like I say, Indigenous governing bodies, until you sign that self-government agreement. Because once all the bands sign self-government agreements, Indigenous Services Canada will dissolve, and it'll be Crown Indigenous Relations implementing your self-government agreement under that new self-government fiscal policy based on revenue sharing, own source revenue or taxation, that municipal corporate model. That's where we're headed, band by band.
They want to cut us loose.
What's
they want to cut us loose without a capital base.
After stealing our lands, territories, and resources, yeah. Unless we go through the claims process that you just described so meticulously, which is really an unfair process too. So the land claims are against us, the self-government's against. It's all about erasing us off the map of Canada so that the provinces are cleared of title and reserves basically become ethnic municipal settlements, But the province will be the one in charge of things, and the federal government for their areas of jurisdiction. And that's what they proposed to do when they started the Indian Act. We were supposed to be protected on reserve until they could assimilate us or civilize us or enfranchise us. Those were the terms they used. They got rid of enfranchisement in 1985, but they're still doing it through other means, through other policies. But that's the final solution. Rolland is right. We're into the final solution now. And most leaders are just trying to cut a deal, or one that they think is going to be sustainable for their band. But it's going to be under this new relationship, right, of self-government. And they're going to try and go into, like Rolland said, the capitalist system to try and manage money. But from what I'm hearing, some of the more so-called advanced bands have spent a lot of their money and they're broke. The ones you'd even think are good at financial administration aren't being very good at it. So I don't know. I'm a practical person. I think we need to protect nature. We're in a climate emergency. But when I look at the communities, and I still work with a number of communities across the country, they're all having social issues, just trying to survive under this colonial structure and system. Because this is structural and systemic systems that we're under. Self-government is a lateral move, like I've been saying. And Ovid used to say this, from an old decrepit jail cell into a new modern jail cell. But self-government is a new jail cell. It's just with a chrome toilet, and maybe a kitchen in there and stuff, but you're still in a jail cell. That's the delegated authority Rolland's talking about. And it will be on parcels of land that will be fee simple, private property. And our traditional territories, we're going to be lucky if we're able to continue to have access and use of them, let alone revenue sharing, you know? Because right now it's up to the provinces to decide if they want to do revenue sharing agreements or not on treaty territories or Aboriginal title territories. And that's what the modern treaties are about in BC, right? You're supposed to make a deal.
In a negotiation sense, I think for the last 50 years, we've been in we've had leverage. We had leverage. They wanted to get rid of the Indian Act. You know, it's colonial in nature. So it gave us some leverage, but they found a way to undermine that leverage, because once you sign away and there's no longer fiduciary links, although historical violations can be pursued, but the once that's cut, you're on your own. And
I think the way they found it, Rolland, was, like I said, 3 times they tried to pass a national law to change the status of band councils to having the rights of a natural person at law. And 3 times the national law was defeated. So now they realize, okay, we're not going to get a national law, you know, accomplishing this. So we're going to have to do it group by group, table by table. You know, we'll do it incrementally.
yeah, I think
by breaking them into smaller chunks.
I'm speculating, but I believe we lose our leverage as well. Not only the fiduciary is lost, but the leverage we had to negotiate our rights on outside our reserves, on the Crown lands, our traditional territories. That what leverage do you have to negotiate on that in future?
Well, look at the Ring of Fire in Ontario. There's a good example of that, because they're divided over a road coming in, which they know the road's going to be used for accessing the mineral to create the dam, the mine. And they're playing around with the environmental assessment, with the consultations. You know, Ontario and Canada are playing around with that.
Yeah.
But they want to get to it because they want to develop those minerals in Northern Ontario. And it's several great communities involved, right? Because there's water and drainage systems and stuff, places where they hunt. But that's a current example of how this stuff is playing out on the ground, you know?
Yep.
Or the Site C dam or the pipelines, you know?
Look where there's been settlements, these comprehensive claim agreements. I mean, you go up into the Cree territory and talk about clear cutting. They've clear cut most of their territory.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's incredible.
Well, because they kept settlement lands and they had rights to hunt, fish, and trap in the Category 2 lands around the community lands, but they didn't have the rights to the trees. So what good are your hunting, fishing, trapping rights if the trees are cut?
Yeah. Well,
Anyway.
When you see the stuff on the ground, that's where you really realize what the end result is.
And then half of our people live in the cities now, you know? So they're not seeing what's going on in the communities unless they're going home to visit and stuff. But a lot of them are living away for school or work or whatever. And when they have votes, you know, for per cap, like a specific claim settlement, and they're giving out per capita payments, everybody wants a chunk of money, right? And that settles the issue, right, for the government. So, they know what they're doing. They've been at this for centuries, really, but decades for sure. And our people don't have the big picture of what's happening. What we're talking about is the big picture. Everybody looks at their little community and says, this is what's happening in my community. That's what I hear from people. Right. My chief and council is doing this. They're getting into a land code. They're going into the 10-year grant. But they're not looking at the bigger picture of that's all coming from Ottawa, and Ottawa has a national plan. So all these things happening on the reserves are all part of this national plan. In order to avoid the international stuff, right? That's where UNDRIP comes in, the manipulation of that, right?
Yeah, totally.
So we've been going at it almost 3 hours here now.
Yeah, so I mean, our format has pretty much been derailed, but I think in a good way, in an organic way. I think we addressed a lot of important things. We still have 21 people viewing consistently in that period of time. Do you guys have any concluding statements you might want to give out there to grassroots communities? You know, who's leading the way? We see what's going on in Wet'suwet'en Wet'en territory with the hereditary chiefs and traditional land defenders, and of course the Sequemic women with the tiny house warriors who've put their little houses in the path of the Trans Mountain Kinder Morgan pipeline. I can even say for myself, in Pemichikamak territory back in 2014, our people occupied Genpeg, this little northern remote community, across Lake Manitoba, and suddenly all eyes were on Pemichikamak, because that the Genpeg hydroelectric dam, it's like the hub of all the generating stations along the Nelson River, controlling the outflows of Lake Winnipeg. And I was talking to Isidore Papanicus, and he said it was the quickest the minister ever showed up in the history of any type of occupations. And it was a victory, and it worked. And I want to tell people, I mean, I haven't lost faith in humanity. There are people that are engaged in these grassroots efforts in a deep, powerful way. And they're using a think tank of indigenous wisdom combined with technological things like computer mapping and all the things that Russ had talked about. This is time. I think it's time to come together in a good way, both allied and indigenous. We can heal this Mother Earth. To do so, we must first come to heal ourselves and try to understand and come up with an idea of what that self-determination plan looks for us, looks for our community, looks like for our communities, and as Russ has said, this isn't going to be like a blanket; it's going to be more of a quilt, But there might be, model communities that might help other communities. So this is important. We do need our allies. It's going to take as many.
Well, before I don't know more, there was the Defenders of the Land Network that Art and I coordinated in Winnipeg.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, when Harper was Prime Minister, and we pulled together Cross Lake and the Secwepemc and the Wet'suwet'en. They were there.
Yeah.
Pretty much most of the struggles you hear about today, they were all there. It was a network of indigenous communities who were dealing with resource extraction. And what Art and I were telling them, look, you've got your own little struggles, and you look at your land struggle locally, but you need to network up and realize we're dealing with Ottawa and all of these struggles, and we're dealing with the provincial capitals in each province, on these resource development projects that are impacting our communities. So we need to network and do things. And we had non-native allies there too. And the Defenders of the Land, for a while there, for a few years, it was pretty active. But then, people started drifting back into focusing on their local struggles and not thinking about the bigger picture. And then when Harper continued on, that's where I Don't Know More kind of came in to play, when he started, changing the Navigable Waters Act, and he was bringing in omnibus legislation to make it easier to take lands from reserves and stuff for economic development, which Trudeau is still doing. In fact, Trudeau is doing a lot of what Harper was doing. He's just calling it something nicer, instead of it being the First Nations. Sorry?
Did the Liberals ever reverse the changes made to the Navigational Waters Act?
No, they came in with another piece of legislation for environmental assessments, but no, they didn't actually revert. They kind of reversed it. They amended it with the Environmental Assessment Act, which was a big bill that they brought in. Again, where they were saying that bands don't have a say, but only Indigenous governing bodies who sign modern treaties or self-government agreements are recognized. Because they consider Indian bands as non-governing bodies because they're governed by the Indian Act, meaning the officials are the minister. They don't recognize any of our inherent rights, like you say, unless it's in their policy, their inherent right policy. That's why they say federally recognized. And that's why I say feds have weaponized recognition, because they don't recognize you have any inherent authority or jurisdiction unless you agree to negotiate under their self-government policy. You know, their inherent right policy.
So basically, they approve it unless they
Yeah,
approve
that's,
it.
well, you have to apply to self-government to them, basically. You
Yeah,
have to fill out an application kit and then
yeah,
you'll get
sign
funding.
up.
Yeah. Basically, that's how it works, right? That's how you get the funding for negotiation.
Yeah,
So I think people have to organize locally, and it's hard because, you know, band councils can influence pain. If people are questioning the band council, they can withhold programs, you know, access to programs. They can make it hard for them. Unless you get enough families and people, a big enough group to start questioning the band council to say, just what is it you're negotiating with Ottawa? What's on the table? How's this going to affect us? You know, before a referendum on a vote on an agreement comes. But not every band can do that because they'll go after individuals and isolate them and punish them. You know,
people don't want to question things.
yeah. So I'm thinking, well, if you got relatives in the city, maybe the idea is to do like treaty forums, regional treaty forums, where you're questioning all the bands and what they're up to from the safety of the city, using your relatives in the city that can raise hell and not be punished by the band council on reserve. You know, if you're off reserve organizing, but bringing these things up as members, right? There's strategies you can use to go after your band councils to flush them out and say just what's going on. And you can do public campaigns and say, look, we're not being informed. There's no transparency here. You know, that's one of the first ways that Trudeau got the chiefs on side. When he got elected in 2015, he suspended the First Nations Financial Transparency Act that Harper brought in. And the chiefs hated that act because they had to put an audit up, post it every year for the members to see, and included all their travel costs and, you know.
The website's still there, isn't it?
It might still be there.
Yeah.
But they suspended that law. That's my point.
Wow.
The chief and councils didn't have to report on that back to Ottawa. And, you know, basically, I don't think they've repealed it yet, but they're talking that under this new fiscal relationship, they're talking about mutual accountability. So they're kind of trying to replace that.
What year
But
was that?
That was in 2015. As soon as they got into power, they suspended it. They were elected in, I think, in October of 2015. By December of 2015, that was one of the first things they did, was they suspended the application of that law. And of course, the chiefs loved them for that. The band members didn't like it, who were critical of their band councils and their spending, because they weren't able to get the reports as easily.
Yeah.
But that started the process of Trudeau government co-opting the band councils, I think. Then he came in and started giving them extra money for programs and services. You know, the tens of billions in the budgets.
Mhm.
It was very clever because, you know, once you co-opt the band councils and the chiefs organizations like AFN, it's pretty hard for the people to fight that. You know, the grassroots people.
And that's a clue as to what the problem is when.
And you and I have spent decades working for band councils and for chiefs organizations, so we know how these, as Art called them, establishment organizations, we know how they work. And they've really been co-opted by the Trudeau government very well, I'd say, more than I've ever seen.
Well,
but that's going to end when the Conservatives are elected in the next federal election.
Yeah.
You know, might be 3 or 4 years down the road, but that, you know, the Liberals have been in power for 10 years, and Canadians will get tired of them. So Canadians are going to vote them out and vote the Conservatives in. And if our people haven't been working on their local self-determination plans that I've been talking about, and if they're still out there hoping that a federal party or a federal government's going to save them, they're going to be screwed even more when the Conservatives come in.
oh
Because
boy.
it's going to be about economic reconciliation, where we're going to fund you if you support this pipeline, or we'll fund you if you support this mine, or we'll fund you if you support this dam. If you support our economic agenda, we'll include you in under economic reconciliation. That's the term the Conservatives are using already. And they have, you know, chiefs lined up for that too, out of Alberta mostly. The oil and gas chiefs, you know, they're all there. The fossil fuels, as I call them.
And they call this decolonizing Canada's relationship with Indigenous people.
Yeah.
It usually means the opposite, whatever they're saying.
Yeah.
Just think the opposite.
Yeah. Like self-government.
Rolland, final words?
Well, I'm glad you had us on, and I hope we weren't too general, because I mean, these things can be applied on almost every detail of dealing with the federal government. And I would just encourage people to try to work together, because having been at home, I see how difficult it is to build awareness and consensus about things, and how nasty it gets. The infighting, you know, in a community, it gets pretty nasty. And like Russ said, you know, they can cut off services to people and so forth. So it makes it very difficult to organize, to create awareness. And those are the things we need to focus on. And it's respecting each other, even when we have differences, I guess, is important. And it's hard sometimes. I mean, I couldn't do it. You know, when I saw when I saw people lying, I thought, my goodness, what the heck? You know, they're not even presenting a fair picture, you know? So, but it's very educational once you realize what's going on, and then you can see it. Once you start to identify it, you can see where, you know, they just promote whatever works in their favor, which is not about recognizing our inherent rights. It's pretty simple.
Thank you. Russ, I don't want anything lingering. You got anything
No,
else?
I'm good. I think, like Rolland said, I'm glad you had us on, and I know it went on like 3 hours. But you know, we did cover a lot of ground. It's the big picture is pretty complicated, because they're talking about constitutional law, international law, conditions on the ground, dirty tricks of the government, the crown government. So we covered a lot.
Where's the Aboriginal Bar Association in all of this?
It's the Indigenous Bar Association, and that's a good question. You know, they're probably working for the places, the clients that have the money, right?
Yeah.
And the clients that have the money are the band councils and the organizations. But
And complying with their oath to the Queen.
Well, I will say one thing about the Indigenous Bar Association and Bill C-15 is they did do a presentation before, I believe, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Bill C-15, the UN Declaration Act, or CANDRIP as I call it. And they did say they couldn't accept it without amendments. And of course, there weren't any amendments, but they never made any more statements. But at least they said it wasn't good enough as is. And maybe the last thing I'd say is Bill C-15 is going to be implemented by Canada, saying they're implementing the UN Declaration. And I had lots of arguments with Romeo Saganash online. We even did an APTN debate, which is online. You can find it, where he was for the bill and I was against it. But he was trying to say by amending the preamble to reject all, doctrines of racial superiority, that including the doctrine of discovery, that was good enough. And I kept saying no, because it's not in the main part of the bill. Section 2 of the Bill C-15 says that the rights of Indigenous peoples are based on Section 35. And after 30 years of Supreme Court decisions, the common law of Canada, those court cases have put legal tests on it, and they're all heavily based on the doctrine of discovery. But that's not in the main part of the bill. So, you know, Romeo was blowing smoke, in my opinion, because, but then he comes from a community that defined their Section 35 rights through the James Bay Agreement, because it became a treaty in 1983 in the Constitution, through that constitutional amendment I referred to. So he has a different fact situation than most other communities that have unresolved title or unresolved treaty issues, you know, around Section 35. So Romeo had a different position to argue from when he was talking about the UN Declaration. But, you know, people that a lot of lawyers see that the common law of Canada, Section 35 common law, is based on the doctrine of discovery. And that's how they're going to interpret the UN Declaration articles. Plus they have Article 46.1, which Rolland referred to, that says nothing in the declaration can affect the state sovereignty or the territorial integrity of the state. So that's kind of the catch-all for all the other clauses, right? The antidote to that, Art always said the most important article was Article 3, the right of self-determination. because there's international instruments that we can attach ourselves to, and the UN Declaration says those apply to Indigenous peoples, Article 3. So the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the UN Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, you know, those human rights that the UN monitors and reports on, we can use those. We don't have to rely on the UN Declaration itself. But a lot of our people need to learn a lot about what's happening internationally, because the United Nations is a whole nother level of bureaucracy. And it's an organization controlled by state governments. But mind you, there's state governments that were former colonies of Europe that are friendly to some of the things we're saying. So it's not all like a white bastion of, you know, European states, although the US and Europe have a lot of influence because they fund it, right? But you can find, you know, some South American countries, Central American countries, some countries from Africa, you know, that are open. Even India, I've seen places where the government of India, their representatives are kind of open to the colonial arguments we raised because they were colonized. They're the real Indians. We're Columbus's Indians. So
We're glad he wasn't looking for Turkey.
yeah. So that was my last point, I guess, is on the UN Declaration stuff. They've domesticated it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank both of you guys. You know, it's been an honor to share space with you, and we've done, you know, multiple series, you know, regarding decolonizing Canada. For those of you who are still with us, you know, like, share, subscribe. Be sure to share this out to your groups, share this out to your grassroots communities, share this out to your universities. And, you know, be sure to support Indigenous journalism. You know, all our people are volunteers, and we don't charge for our webinars. It's free for download and distribution for our grassroots communities to help empower their efforts. Yeah, so
Good job. We need more stuff like this.
we'll just keep these educational segments going because I don't think anybody is handling this in the detail you know, that you gentlemen and some of the others with us have handled up until this point. And this is, you know, these are critical times. This is the, you know, what you might call the end game of colonialism. You know, this is the fulfillment of the Indian Act, complete assimilation, you know, allowing the Crown to offload its treaty and fiduciary obligations. And, you know,
What could be
where
done?
Joe Wild was saying that, you know, what's not delineated and described would be extinguished. I mean, these are real things that are going on. We cannot give up our rights to sovereignty and self-determination. Roland, what were
I
you
was
gonna?
just going to suggest maybe in future we could do individual policy issues or legislation, particular pieces of legislation, and explore those in depth. Because we're covering the broad range here, and each one has its place within the assimilation strategy.
I think that's a good idea. So again, thank you everybody for enduring. It's been over 3 hours, and for those of you who are still with us,
Big wets.
we have a long way to go. So
Yeah.
hi.
Yeah.
We'll keep in touch.
Okay.
Thank
Many
you.
blessings,
Big
you
wets,
guys.
everyone.
All my
Bye.
relations. Ikose.
Uh-huh.